table, doubling up and doubling up again, waiting for the final double up that would break him even. Finally, I don't know. Maybe he saw the handwriting on the wall and decided as long as he was going to get nabbed at some point, he would put something away for the day he got out of jail. I don't know. To do that, he would have had to have Confederates somewhere else, someone working in one of the commodity houses. One day in the summer of 1970, Paul was preparing to go on vacation. At that point, he had condoned the jiggle of leasing consultants and knew that there was speculation going on in commodities. But the depth of the trouble lay ahead. He stopped by the office of the bank's chief accountant, who said he had a question. It was a small piece of pink paper with a debit of 25 million Swiss francs. The accountant said it must be a mistake. Paul hadn't a clue. I knew something was wrong, Paul said. I knew I should stay and sort it out, but the family hadn't had a vacation in a long time. One of the items on Paul's desk was a partial translation of the annual report, done internally. Foreign exchange, foreign currency, and margin positions for commodities had been lumped together in one big number. There was that mysterious pink slip for 25 million Swiss francs, apparently a realized cocoa trade. Paul deleted the reference to margin in the report, even though it had already circulated in German and had been approved by the Swiss Banking Commission. Why wave a red flag if you don't have to, Paul said. We needed time to clear things up. The family took off for Marbella, Spain, but Paul did not enjoy his vacation. I didn't sleep very well, he said. I had a tummy ache. Paul decided that the vacation just wasn't going to work, with unanswered questions floating around. Why had that accountant given him a chit for 25 million Swiss francs and then asked what it was? What else was wrong? Something wasn't right, and I wasn't facing it, Paul said, a bit belatedly. Back to Basel went the family, and behind Kummerly's back, Paul started a low-key investigation. There were, it seemed, huge losses in the commodity department. So according to Paul, he called Kummerly in, and something like the following dialogue took place. Paul, what's going on? Kummerly, losses. Paul, I know losses, but how much? Kummerly, I don't know. Paul, why not? Kummerly, I just lost control. Paul, how much are the losses? 5 million? Kummerly, more than that, I lost control. Paul, 10 million? 15 million? Kummerly, more than that, I think. Paul, 20 million? Kummerly, somewhere around there, I think. And Kummerly kept muttering, losses, and we lost control. At 20 million, not only was the bank gone, but so were 1.5 more banks the same size. Paul decided that he had better carry the message to Los Angeles personally, and he caught the daily Swissair early bird from Basel to Paris, and then an Air France flight over the pole to Southern California. Paul and Helly checked into the Century Plaza in Los Angeles. Neil Moore, a senior vice president of the UCB, met them. Don't give me the details, Moore said. Just tell me the loss, down to the penny. On Sunday, August 30, Frank King led the group of UCB officials who met with Paul in a conference room at the Beverly Hilton. The president of the bank, according to Paul, was philosophical. Win some, lose some, he said. The one concern everyone seemed to have was to keep the affair secret to avoid a run on the bank. How many people know about this? Paul was asked. Can we keep it all a secret? The bank's chief auditor was worried about the extent of the loss. We could handle $5 million, he said, but 20 million? 20 million could mean trouble even for Frank King. 2 days later, Paul and Helly and Neil Moore and an attorney for the bank flew back to Basel. Nobody said much across the Atlantic, Helly recalls. Outside auditors went to work on the bank's books. The losses seemed to be closer to $30 million than to $20 million. In Los Angeles, Paul had tendered his resignation, but he was to remain as an executive and consultant to straighten the mess. The idea was that the bank would remain open, still the United California Bank's Swiss unit. The parent would work out a scheme to protect depositors and creditors. On September 6, there was a board meeting of the United California Bank in Basel, but Paul did not stay long. He was asked to leave the room and told that he was fired. I went home and had a scotch. The UCB officials went to the Swiss Bank Commission in Bern and presented their plan to reimburse the depositors and creditors. The Swiss Bank Commission naturally was worried about the reputation of Swiss banks. The word around Basel was that once that was protected, they were glad to see an American-owned bank get a black eye. Now it would be easier to keep the foreigners out of Switzerland. The details of what went on between the UCB officials and the Swiss Bank Commission are not known. Again, there were rumors that the Commission told the UCB that if it would make good and get out of Switzerland, it would be kept out of the trial to follow as much as possible. On September 10th, the bank suspended operations, and on September 16th at 2 p.m., it posted notices on its doors saying it was bankrupt. The United California Bank in Basel AG was by no means the first Swiss bank to go broke. In the Depression of the 1930s, 3 of the top 7 Swiss banks folded, just as banks everywhere did. Swiss banks were overinvested in Germany and suffered from the German inflation of the 1920s and the rise of the Nazis, and then from the impact of World War II on their German investments. In more recent years, the German bank had folded because of bad loans, and the Asian Bank and Arbitrex on speculation, and the Seligman Bank had bought a huge tract of land south of Rome without clearing the building permits, and expired suffocated by illiquidity. So busted banks were not new to Switzerland, but my bank goes in the almanac. That is the biggest Swiss bust ever. Paul was about to come down to breakfast on Wednesday, September 9th. He was wearing loafers without socks, and was in his shirt sleeves when 2 Basel policemen appeared at the door. They said he was wanted for questioning. Paul expected this. He would be there, he thought, 2 or 3 days. The Basel police also picked up the Lee boys, Kummerly and Zummerli, as well as Helmut Bruschke, the accountant Beat Schweitzer, Louis Thol, and Alfred Kaltenbach. Paul was shown to a cell with a toilet and fold-up bed and a table. The schedule went like this: lights on at 6:30 a.m., and a broom handed through the door. At 7 a.m., a mug of cocoa and some bread. The mug reached for at 7:30. Occasionally a half hour in the exercise yard was offered. Then lunch through the door at 11. Lunch was not so bad, Paul said. Dinner, soup and black bread, came through the door at 5, and the lights went out at 9:30 p.m. At 8 a.m. every morning, the warden came by and asked through the door if everything was all right. The Basel prison itself is a grim 17th century building, downtown with small windows high above the floors. Even though no charges had been brought against him, Paul was not allowed to see a lawyer. He was permitted to write 2 letters a week, and allowed 1 visit of about 15 minutes per week from his wife. The expected questioning did not materialize for weeks. Then there would be a key turning in the door, and a guard would escort him to another building for interrogation. I asked if the guard was armed. He was armed with a dog, Paul answered, but that was all. Paul faced the investigating magistrate across the table. What happened? Asked the investigating magistrate. For Helly, life was, if anything, even more difficult. She was, first of all, without means, since the family's assets were all in the bank. She got a job as a secretary with a pharmaceutical firm, and moved the girls and her Alsatian help, who volunteered to stay without pay, to a small apartment. I was scared, Helly said, because no one in Basel would talk to me. I thought the house was watched. People were afraid to call me on the telephone. It was like a bad criminal show on TV. Later, some of Helly's Basel friends were to say that it served her right for marrying an American, and that an American so aggressive had to have unsound practices and was therefore getting what he deserved. Some of the Baselers suggested this was a good time for a divorce. Basel, Helly said, is not a pleasant place for a woman alone with children, especially one whose husband is in trouble. When Helly was not working, she was trying to get Paul released on bail and talking to lawyers, but it looked as though, if bail ever were to be set, it would be 1 million Swiss francs, or about $250,000. That would be far beyond anything she could raise. The general feeling was that Helly's husband had committed a crime so unspeakable it could barely be discussed. Murder, at least, was comprehensible. But Paul was still not charged. In Switzerland, a citizen may be held on suspicion for 3 weeks, with the 3-week periods continuously renewed if the authorities feel they need additional investigation. Paul was to spend 10 months in the Basel prison, most of it in solitary, all without bail and without being charged. When his lawyer inquired, he was told that the charge would probably be Verdacht der Unguntrun Geschäftsführung, which turned out not to be crimes against the bank, but suspicion of untrue management, to which Urkundenfälschung, falsification of documents, was added. Later I asked a Swiss lawyer about the process. This is not an Anglo-Saxon country, he said. We do not have the doctrine of habeas corpus, nor the underlying idea of innocent until proved guilty. The job of the investigating magistrate is to determine as far as possible the truth, and if you hold a citizen in jail and permit him to talk to no one, only the investigating magistrate, that is quite efficient. What I asked, if the citizen were innocent. If he is innocent, then he receives justice, the Swiss lawyer said. He is paid his former salary for his jail time. If his salary is $60,000 a year, then he is paid that. And of course, if he is guilty, the time he serves counts, and for good behavior it counts half again, and the sentences are not as long as in the United States. At first I was glad it was over, Paul said, and I really thought I would be there only a week or two. I was guilty of negligence, no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean I should spend years in solitary, eh? After a few weeks I could see if I just sat in the cell I would become a vegetable. So I established a strict discipline. After sweeping my cell, I did half an hour of calisthenics. Then I asked for a typewriter. I decided that as long as I was in jail and in solitary, I would write a novel. Paul, of course, was not an ordinary prisoner. He was an uncharged bank president, and the Basel prison was no Attica. Spartan it might be, but it was also Swiss. In Switzerland you get what you pay for. Paul paid for subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times of London, The Economist, and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, the leading Swiss newspaper. He also paid for the rental of a television set. Within a short time, he said, I was as well informed as I have ever been in my life. Except for the uncertainty, I enjoyed the rest. It was not only a 17th century jail, it was a 17th century prison life, like Captain Macheath in The Beggar's Opera, who could send out to the best restaurants for his meals and even for Polly. You could send out for meals only on occasion, Paul said, if you pay for them. In Switzerland, you can have what you pay for. Meanwhile, back at the ranch in New York, I did what any aggrieved citizen would do. I called a lawyer. Several, in fact. It should, I figured, be interesting. After all, this was not just a sour investment, a stock that went down. This was a crime. The management of the bank was all in jail. For crimes there is some sort of justice. The reaction of the great Wall Street law firms was very interesting. Enough to inspire a certain amount of cynicism, if you are inclined to be cynical about lawyers. They acknowledged there was a case, but scuttled away like rabbits through the brush because of their own banking connections. I was as popular with the Wall Street lawyers as a Black Panther. One friend said, listen, don't think we don't take unpopular cases. Why? We represent ex-Nazis out of Spandau. Rich ex-Nazis, I grant you. We represent Greek ship owners who are so far beyond any national laws they think a law is an insult. But you're talking about an action against a bank. We represent a major New York City bank. This is a major West Coast bank. They do a lot of business together. Our New York City bank pays a lot of the bills, and they wouldn't like us in this. Sorry, baby, but go away. I called Abe. I should have done that first, anyway. Abraham Pomerantz is 69, portly, and has a nice white mane. He is also the name that scares banks most, not to mention mutual funds and other financial institutions, because Abe is the Ralph Nader of the investment business. There are differences, of course. Ralph Nader lives in a boarding house and operates from a payphone down the hall. Abe lives in a penthouse and operates from the senior partner's corner suite of a prosperous midtown law firm. Ralph Nader burns with righteous zeal. Abe thinks there are many defects in the society which can be corrected through legal action, and he gets enormously well paid for the corrections when they worked. One day in the early 1930s, when Abe was a struggling young lawyer, the widow of his high school gym teacher came to see him. The widow, Galen's husband, had left her 20 shares of the National City Bank. Once they had been worth $400 a share, and now they were worth only $20 a share. I remember telling her there was no law against losing money, Abe said, and the widow Galen went away. Then the Senate Committee on Banking and Currency, identified usually by its counsel, Ferdinand Pecora, began to investigate the skullduggery that had gone on in some of the nation's boardrooms. the excessive compensation, the dealing in corporate assets, and so on. Charles Mitchell and some of the directors of the National City Bank seem to be high on the list. In a famous case adequately chronicled elsewhere, Abe filed suit on behalf of the Widow Gallon against National City Bank, and hence its stockholders, in a derivative action. So called because the stockholders derive their rights from the shares in the corporation they own. The stockholder who brings the suit brings it on behalf not only of himself but of his class, that is, his fellow stockholders. The courts awarded the Widow Gallon $1.8 million, of which Abe and the lawyers and accountants who worked on the case took $472,500. Abe became a champion of the minority stockholder. The Chase Bank was next. That was $2.5 million for a Mrs. Gertrude Bookbinder. Abe went on to test the way mutual funds used the commissions derived from buying and selling their portfolios to pay for the selling of their funds. Excessive sales loads for mutual funds, using the commissions to buy research, and so on. In the courts, he questioned the way banks used the commissions from their trust departments to gain deposits for themselves. Eventually, he even got to the drug companies on the price fixing for tetracycline, which resulted in a judgment against the drug companies of $152 million. Since it was impossible to pay back the individual consumers of the drugs, that amount was spread out among the health departments of the 50 states. Most of Abe's efforts, though, were in the securities and investment fields, and the structure of that industry was hardly the same for having known Abe. So I called Abe. Normally, and at this stage of his career, Abe does not take phone calls from private citizens, however grievously wounded. But in our peregrinations through the securities business, our paths had crossed. Abe had already read about it in the papers. He told me to come right up. Makes me feel young again, Abe said. I had made up a list of questions. If a big bank bought a little bank, and hence had the power to hire and fire people, and in fact the right to name the whole board, weren't they responsible for proper procedures? They did have that power. They had, in fact, fired the president in 10 minutes one Sunday without even telling us junior partners. So wasn't the big bank guilty of Ungetrun Geschäftsführung, even if they weren't guilty of Urkundenfälschung? And the outside auditors certified all the Urkundenfälschung and the Ungetrun Geschäftsführung. Price Waterhouse and Pete Marwick had gotten into a lot of trouble for less. Weren't the auditors liable too? And the board? Naturally, the board. But when I went to see Abe, he was in a sober mood. He had read through some research, and he looked up from the papers. If this had happened in this country, he said, this would be worth $100 million as a class action. But it happened in Switzerland, and everything in Switzerland is a secret. We don't even know who the stockholders are. Switzerland is a very backward country. They have never heard of a class action. So the answer to all your questions is yes. Yes, the board is clearly liable, but the management of the bank is in jail and clearly busted, except for the 2 Californians from the parent. And yes, if it were here, the auditors would be culpable. And yes, if it were here, the controlling bank would have a liability. But it wasn't here, so I can't take the case. But I like you and you like me, and out of all the people that the UCB doesn't want to have overhanging the cleanup of this, the 2 of us have to be at the top of the list. I have a reputation as an ogre in this field, and so I will write them on my ogre stationery and will offer them your stock at cost. Maybe they'd like to buy out a partner just to clean things up. Their name was all over the prospectus after all. But the United California Bank didn't seem eager to buy any more stock. We got a stiff letter from O'Melveny and Myers, the lawyers for the United California Bank. The entity to which we referred, they said, was a Swiss bank. Funny it had the same name, but clearly, how could they be involved? I was afraid of that, Abe said. You see, that's the trouble. This whole damn thing is in Switzerland. The Swiss won't even tell you the telephone number. You'll have to sue in Switzerland, and the trouble with that is there is no bank left in Switzerland, so there's nothing left to sue. And the United California Bank itself is in Los Angeles. Is there no justice? I asked. That's a metaphysical question, Abe said. I don't know if there is or isn't justice, but I do know one thing. There's no class action in that damn backward country over there. You know, I had a client once who put me into a sure thing in commodities. What happened? Seemed to be the proper inquiry. I lost my shirt, Abe said. I've never made a penny on an investment. It's good I've been lucky in the law. While I was pondering the fickleness of justice and its limitations at natural boundaries, Paul was typing away in his cell. After a while, the stringent regulations relaxed a bit. Paul was allowed to go to the prison library, but he found it disorganized. He got permission to use some of the other prisoners in reorganizing and cataloging the library. Furthermore, he said, there are people of other nationalities in the Basel jail. Yugoslavs, Spaniards, Englishmen. There's nothing for them to read. Paul wrote to the ambassadors of 13 countries and asked them to donate old books to the Basel prison. Some of them did. When the reorganization of the library was complete, the warden of the prison gave a dinner for the library task force. He and his wife served it themselves, and we had a very acceptable wine, Paul said. One by one, the bank's management was released from prison on bail. Louis Thole had a nervous breakdown, was released and went to Belgium. In the early summer of 1971, Paul was released on bail of 500,000 Swiss francs, raised from Harry Schultz, Helly's family and some friends. Paul went to England to work for the Harry Schultz letter. All the prisoners were out on bail except Kummerly. And the word was that Kummerly, pending of course his guilt or innocence at trial, would be in custody a long time. Paul had had one confrontation with Kummerly before the investigating magistrate. Kummerly said that everyone knew the books were doctored, and that he got his orders from Los Angeles. He might as well have said from Joan of Arc or Jesus, Paul said. There was some speculation around Basel as to whether Kummerly had really gone off the deep end in jail, or whether this was a foxy act so that he would be allowed to serve his time in a mental institution rather than in prison. There was also some talk about Frau Kummerly, who was bombing around town in a flashy Mercedes. There is a phrase in Schweizerdeutsch which translates as green widow. A green widow is one who obviously knows where some of the green is for, which her husband is serving time. The investigating authorities sent questionnaires to all the commodity brokers who dealt with the UCB Basel and cocoa. All were returned except the one from Lomcrest in London. I went over the prospectus once more, masochist that I am. There it was, the bridge between conservative Swiss banking and modern corporate and financial techniques, usually identified with the United States. The present situation, then, it said, is that the bank is a subsidiary of United California Bank of Los Angeles, a bank with total assets of $5.2 billion at the end of 1969. United California Bank is, in turn, affiliated with Western Bank Corporation, the world's largest bank holding company, embracing 23 full-service commercial banks located in 11 western states of the United States. United California Bank itself is the full owner of an international bank in New York City, and has branches, representatives, or affiliates in England, Belgium, Switzerland, Spain, Lebanon, Japan, Mexico, and Greece. It has direct correspondent relations with important banks throughout the world. The music began to rise again. The sun would never set on our fast-growing Swiss bank. I was trying to abstract some lesson from the experience, but I knew that if tomorrow someone brought me the fastest-growing financial institution in Switzerland, with that kind of affiliation, and with a dynamic young management, I would probably do it all over again. There was one thing that bugged me above all others. When I called you, I asked Paul, and asked you how the bank was doing at the time the bank was raising more capital, you knew that all was not well, and you didn't say a word. We were opening new branches in Zurich and Geneva, Paul said. We were going to have banks in Brussels and Luxembourg. We had a little problem with the balance sheet, but who would have thought we couldn't work things out? I asked Paul what he was going to do next. I don't think I'll be the president of a bank, he said. I didn't think so either. I'm going to finish my book, he said. I read the first 60 pages of Paul's novel. Belatedly, maybe I did learn something. It was set in the near future. The world was involved in a financial crisis. Treasury officials from various countries were flying from capital to capital. Among the characters were a Russian from the Narodny Bank, a titled Englishman from the Bank of England, a bluff American, a safe-cracker named Sammy, the Basel police, and a stiff, austere Swiss banker who was about to pull off an audacious and entirely legal currency coup, which would result in a profit to his bank of $1 billion. $1 billion. The greatest kendo stroke of all time. Chapter 10. Somebody must have done something right. The lessons of the master. What we had hoped to do in the soberer days of our Swiss bank was to create some supercurrency in Europe. Before the bizarre events, we had hoped the plan would go this way. Our bank would prosper and grow. Then it would offer some of its shares to European investors, and also to Americans if they would pay their government's penalty tax. Then the shares would be traded, probably in London and Brussels and Zurich, and we would have a supercurrency. We could buy other banks and other services with supercurrency instead of cash, and any time one of the stockholders wanted a chalet or a new cuckoo clock, he would peel off a few shares of our supercurrency. It would be Swiss supercurrency, too. And as the dollar had troubles, that would make a Swiss supercurrency sell at an even bigger premium. Some of the creators of supercurrency came to grief, and so did many of the traders in it. But not all by any means. The casualty list was typical, but not universal. There were those who kept their counsel and their cool. There is only one dean of our profession, if security analysis can be said to be a profession. The reason that Benjamin Graham is undisputed dean is that before him there was no profession, and after him they began to call it that. He came to Wall Street in 1914. 20 years later he published the first edition of Security Analysis, the first and reigning textbook in the field. Big, black, and forbidding, it has gone through 4 editions. Generations, plural now, of analysts have grown up with Graham and Dodd, as it is called, Dodd being David Dodd, the Columbia professor who was and is co-author of the book. Graham himself taught at Columbia on and off for 18 years, and also at UCLA. When Graham arrived on the scene, a security analyst was a statistician, an ink-stained wretch wearing a green eyeshade and sitting on a 3-legged stool, who gave figures to the partner in charge of running that day's pool. Now there are examinations and learned analyst societies, and the appellation CFA, or Certified Financial Analyst. That makes Graham dean, but it would not necessarily make him respected in the downtown canyons, since professors of finance rarely move stocks, and respect is today's buck after all. But Graham was also an active investor. He put in about 20-odd years at it, as the head of his own investment company, Graham Newman, which was considered a very smart outfit 1 generation ago, and he retired a very comfortable multimillionaire. Graham is now 78, and travels to his houses in Mallorca, in the south of France, and in La Jolla. That makes him respected, in addition to making him dean. One day I got a letter from the good dean, who was at his house in the south of France. It is a nice letter, and so characteristic of the dean that you might as well read it all. It tells you a lot in a brief moment. La Champousse, 42, Avenue des Marseilles, 42, Aix-en-Provence. September 6, 1968. Mr. Adam Smith, care of Random House, New York City. Dear Adam Smith, this is an appreciative note about the money game from the chap you call the Dean of all Security Analysts. I read your book with a great deal of enjoyment and with admiration for your many-faceted culture. Also, it gave me a lot of information on what has been happening in Wall Street since I left it some years ago. I think I understand pretty well everything in the book that's in non-mathematical English. However, your Greek on page 25 gave me a bit of trouble. The second part is evidently a version of the well-known Quem Deus vult perdere, prius dementat. But your text has octave instead of octave. Does the preceding part mean, when a beam falls every man gathers wood? If so, your dovag must be changed to docog. And where does the quotation come from? Thanks in advance for your reply, and sincere congratulations on your book. Benjamin Graham. P.S. Also, shouldn't it be MMA, Recamier instead of de Stael, page 221, and Hinselmenschen for mention, page 270. That's for your next printing. You know something right away. Nobody messes with the dean as far as the classics are concerned. Too many Wall Streeters. Horace is the guy who works in the cage in the back room tallying the margin accounts. Benjamin Graham has always been a classicist. The prescript to security analysis is a marvelously apt quotation from Horace's Ars Poetica. Multa renescentur, queum se sidera, candentque, que nunc sunt un honere vocabulae. Many shall be restored that now are fallen, and many shall fall that now are in honor. It is nice to hear good words from the dean, even with the ruler taps on the wrist. We did have to have a special printer for the great quotation, and any good proofreader would have realized the otave should have been otave. Hinselmission should certainly have a C. You can't catch them all. I did, however, mean Madame de Staël, not Madame Récamier. After some further correspondence, the good dean came to town, and we had breakfast at the Plaza. Graham is a short, dapper man with a vague resemblance to Edward G. Robinson. He was in town, he said, to see a publisher about the new translation of Aeschylus he had just completed, and then he was going to see some of his grandchildren. When we met, the market was sliding, and the performance nicks were in their final throes. I asked him what he thought of what was going on. "Oh, I don't keep up any more," he said. "I only own one stock, and the rest is all municipal bonds. But these periods have come before. As it was written once, hoc etiam transibit. This too will pass. What was the one stock? That's just leftover, government employees' life insurance. We owned the whole company at one point. I don't even keep up with that. I've reached a stage where I'm just giving things away, not trying to make more." We talked about events since the last edition of Security Analysis. Benjamin Graham had an idea he wanted to talk to me about. A new edition of The Intelligent Investor was forthcoming, that book being more or less a distillation of the textbook, Security Analysis, only for the layman. Graham wanted me to work on it, more or less by long-distance correspondence with him. I could send the relevant chapters to Aix-en-Provence, or Mallorca, or La Jolla, and he would send them back again. "There are really only two people I would want to work on this," Graham said. "You're one, and the other is Warren Buffett." "Who's Warren Buffett?" I asked. That, as it turns out, was a rather extraordinary question at the time. Extraordinary because I knew most of the highly visible professional money managers of the time. They spoke at seminars, delineated their theories, dressed up and trotted out their favorite industries and their favorite stocks. I didn't know Warren Buffett. He was not in the chain letter for Four Seasons or Viatron, or even for Control Data or Polaroid. That, of course, would have made him atypical, but not remarkable. What was remarkable was that Buffett was easily the outstanding money manager of the generation. And what was more remarkable was that he did it with the philosophy of another generation. While the gunslingers of the 60s were promoting each other over drinks at Oscars, then going back to their offices so they could watch the tape, Buffett was compiling the best records in the industry from Omaha, Nebraska. No quote machines, no ticker, no Oscars, no chewed fingernails, no tranquilizers, no galusil, no backgammon after the close, no really big spectacular winners, no technological companies, no conglomerates, no concepts. Just pure Benjamin Graham, applied with absolute consistency, quiet, simple stocks, easy to understand, with a lot of time left over for the kids, for handball, for listening to the tall corn grow. Buffett, it's true, did not manage a public fund, so he was not subject to the pressures of salesmen wanting to sell the fund. While he made his record with the philosophy of another generation, some of his big winners were also well within the growth stock philosophy. He did not have a committee to deal with, and he did not have a boss. He kept himself out of the public eye, though for most of his career the public eye would not have been on him anyway. If he bought so much of a company that he controlled it, he was willing to step into the business. All of these factors freed him from more typical restraints. His partnership began in 1956 with $105,000, largely supplied by uncles, aunts, and other assorted relatives. It ended in 1969 with $105 million and a compounded growth rate of 31%. $10,000 invested in the partnership in 1957 would have grown to $260,000. Over that time, the partnership did not have a single losing year, and it gained in the years of severe market declines, 1962 and 1966 among them. The partners in the Buffett partnership received a letter annually telling them the goals of the partnership, and the same consistency ran through the 10 or so letters. The money managers of the 60s habitually took a record of 1 or 2 hot years, gave it to the salesmen, and let them bring in the people. Buffett's record ran for 13 years and wasn't merchandised in any way. In fact, as the partners began to see the success, they wanted their own relatives in, and Warren couldn't accommodate them because this was a private partnership of limited members. Warren Buffett was a far more logical choice than I was to work on Graham's new edition, and indeed, he did do some work on it, though he and Benjamin Graham, pupil and master, did not agree on everything, and Warren is acknowledged but doesn't share the authorship. Shortly after I met Graham, Warren came to town and we had lunch, and this was followed by other similar meetings and a rather desultory correspondence until finally I went to the west bank of the Missouri with my various marked-up Graham texts. There, in the heartland, Warren and I went over the lessons of the master to see what was still relevant, like two scholars over the scripture. Having compiled his record, and having made both himself and his partners quite comfortable, Warren did another unusual thing. He quit. They hung up the jersey and retired the number. He was then 39. He said that it was getting harder and harder to have good ideas, and of course his own drive had been somewhat dimmed by his own success, since he had then $25 million or so to his own name, and there are other stages of life. Of the scholars and the scripture in a moment. Warren's own story serves as such a cute counterpoint to what was going on at exactly the same time elsewhere in the financial world that it is worth telling on its own. I find a certain nostalgia in this triumph of Middle America. It seems almost to have taken place in another country than the one which experienced the Vietnam War, a changing morality, student riots, and a burgeoning military-industrial bureaucracy. Warren was born in Omaha, the 7th generation of Buffett in that city since the first Nebraskan Buffett opened a grocery store in 1869. Warren's father was a stockholder, but his main interest was in politics. In Omaha in the 1930s, stockbroking cannot have been an overwhelmingly fascinating occupation, though it must have exposed Warren to the atmosphere early on. Warren remembers chalking the board on his father's office as a boy. Howard Buffett ran for Congress 5 times, serving 4 terms as a Republican from Omaha, and Warren moved to Washington at 12. He was already interested in the market the way some lads used to be in baseball averages. And he was interested in business. He had, of course, the prerequisite for all business success stories, a paper route. He delivered the Washington Post, which enabled him 25 years later to tell Katharine Graham, the owner, that he had once worked for her. Together with a friend, he also had a business delivering and servicing pinball machines in barber shops. That was good for $50 a week. The paper route was good for $175 a month. And Warren saw no reason to go to college. It interfered with business. His father prevailed, and he went to the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business and Finance for 2 years. He wasn't exactly turned on by it. It didn't seem like I was learning a lot. After 2 years, he transferred to the University of Nebraska, and by taking an accelerated course, was out in another year. At Nebraska, Warren had still another business. He sold golf balls. Once he showed me his ledgers, his net worth carefully calculated, all on lined paper and cramped round handwriting. His first stock purchase, 3 shares of Cities Service Preferred, and the golf ball business. The ledger itself looks like what Horatio Alger might have donated to the Baker Library at the Harvard Business School. The net worth starts very, very modestly. The initial capital, after all, is merely the proceeds from the paper route, the pinball machine servicing, and the selling of golf balls. Warren was also into the market. Although his older sister had to sign the appropriate papers, since he was not yet 21. I went the whole gamut, he says. I collected charts, and I read all the technical stuff. I listened to tips, and then I picked up Graham's security analysis. That was like seeing the light. Warren went off to Columbia University Business School to study under the master, and when he graduated he worked for Graham Newman for 2 years, commuting from White Plains. He had married Susie, an attractive blonde girl from Omaha, when he was 21. Graham Newman was further training in the same principles, but Warren did not like the pace of New York or the commuting. In 1956 he returned to Omaha and started his partnership. All his partners were relatives or friends. The partners were to get a return of the first 6% of the profits. and the profits in excess of that were to be split, with 1/4 to the general partner, who comprised the entire operation. For the first 6 years, the office was an upstairs bedroom in the Rambling House Warren had bought for $30,000, located in a relatively unfashionable section of Omaha. This was the fashionable part of Omaha maybe 40 years ago, Warren said, when we drove out to the house. Now everything's moved on much further west. I think most of my neighbors make $10,000 to $15,000 a year. You can be anywhere in 5 minutes from here. The house is on a pleasant, Midwestern, tree-shaded street. It looks like the same section of Kansas City or Indianapolis or Des Moines. You would need only a jalopy and some high school youngsters, and that street and those trees and those houses to have a 1947 Saturday Evening Post cover. Warren's house is a rambling affair, more rambling because the Buffetts added on another room when they wanted to, and an indoor paddleball and handball court. The house is full of books and the walls of posters. War is unhealthy for children and other living things. It is the obvious gathering place for neighborhood children. The Buffetts have 2 children in Central High School. One of them is named after Benjamin Graham, where Warren's father and grandfather went, and one at the University of Nebraska. Susie works energetically for Planned Parenthood and for the Panel of Americans. Among all the books is a shelf on Bertrand Russell. Warren can quote Bertrand Russell almost as well as he can quote Ben Graham. Obviously, as the Buffett partnership grew, so did Warren's contacts on Wall Street. And some of those contacts must have asked him why Omaha, for his answers show the question has occurred to everybody. I can be anywhere in 3 hours, Warren says. New York or Los Angeles. Maybe a little longer since they took the nonstop off. I get all the excitement I want in those visits. I probably have more friends in New York and California than here, but this is a good place to bring up children and a good place to live. You can think here. You can think better about the market. You don't hear so many stories, and you can just sit and look at the stock on the desk in front of you. You can think about a lot of things.
What did Ben tell you?
Warren asked before dinner one night, as I stirred my scotch and he stirred his Pepsi-Cola. He told me medius tutimus ibis, I said, which he explained as what
Phoebus Apollo told Phaeton
about chariot driving, and the bum didn't listen. You go safest in the middle course. That's Ben all right, Warren said. Gee, Ben really knows languages. Ben really liked learning things. The one thing he didn't care much about was money. I don't think Ben ever knew how much money he had. To win, the first thing you have to do is not lose. That is my own distillation of one of Graham's first principles. It sounds absolutely simplistic. Of course you shouldn't lose if you want to win. There is more to it than that. This is a rational statement in a rational world, even though Keynes once said there was nothing more disastrous than a rational investment policy in an irrational world. And it excludes all the people who really do want to lose,
because their parents told them they were losers,
or for whatever psychological fulfillment they might get. Graham does not do much to feed the fantasies of those who would say, turn 5,000 into $250,000. He starts with the supposition that your money is at risk. The first thing you must do is not lose your money, even before you think about making more with it. The joys of compounding are there if you keep your stake growing. But all you need have is 1 year in which you give back half, and your program, at the same growth rate, must stretch out years and years longer. And he is not sanguine about your ability to judge the market or even to judge individual stocks. Everyone knows that most people who trade in the market lose money at it in the end. The people who persist in trying it are either unintelligent or willing to lose money for the fun of the game, or gifted with some uncommon and incommunicable talent. In any case, they are not investors. A great deal of brain power goes into this field, and undoubtedly some people can make money by being good stock market analysts. But it is absurd to think that the general public can ever make money out of market forecasts. For who will buy when the general public, at a given signal, rushes to sell out at a profit? Too many clever and experienced people are engaged simultaneously in trying to outwit one another in the market. The result, we believe, is that all their skill and efforts tend to be self-neutralizing, or to cancel out, so that each experience and highly informed conclusion ends up being no more dependable than the toss of a coin. Graham had little faith that even stock market analysts themselves could, as a group, prove consistent winners. We once likened the activities of the host of stock market analysts to a tournament of bridge experts. Everyone is very brilliant indeed, but scarcely anyone is so superior to the rest as to be certain of winning a prize. An added quirk in Wall Street is that the prominent market analysts freely communicate and exchange their views almost from day to day. The result is somewhat as if all the participants in a bridge tournament, while each hand was being played out, gathered around and argued about the proper strategy. Modern stock market movements, in fine, are the result of a concentration of tremendous skill in a limited area, where profits can be made by smart people only at the expense of other people who are almost equally smart. The metaphor is very much like Keynes's market metaphor of musical chairs. You can see why I was the wrong choice to work on the next edition of Graham. In Graham's view, the stock market is what the game theory economists would call a zero-sum two-person game. That is, one person wins what the other one loses, as in a gin rummy game, or one team wins over another team, as in a bridge game. But my own apprenticeship was geared to the recognition of small, rapidly growing companies.
The company was worth $20 million when it was small and $600 million after it grew up.
Someone else did not have to lose in order for you to win. Of course, over a long period of time and with enough participants, there is a zero-sum game simply because there is a buyer for every seller. This concept, it should be added, is relative to the market. If the whole market moves up, then the losers have lost only relative to the winners. They still may have more than they started with. Conversely, if the market moves down, even the winners may have less than they started with. Mathematicians everywhere are undoubtedly working on the final and complete equation for the whole thing. Well, all right, not to lose is a very good ambition. It will be hard for optimistic young tigers to bother with, or even people looking for increments to their life from the market, other than the ones they might rationally expect. How not to lose? There is one important proviso, Graham wrote. The shares must be purchased at reasonable market levels, that is, levels that are reasonable in the light of fairly well-defined standards, derived from past experience. Nothing wrong with that. Some of Graham's critics say that properly applied, this would have kept him out of most of the market from 1949 to 1969, because the market levels never looked reasonable in terms of the way they had looked from 1929 to 1949. IBM, for example, was never right to Graham. $1 of 1949 earnings on IBM was valued 3.4 times as liberally as $1 earned by Atchison, and 4 times as $1 earned by Atlantic Refining. The price itself of IBM precludes the margin of safety which we consider essential to a true investment. IBM, said Graham, was a speculation. It might turn out all right, but that was a speculation. To Graham, a stock had intrinsic value. In the dark ages of the 30s, it was not so hard to find intrinsic value. Some companies were selling for less than the cash they had in the bank, and many for less than their true book value, or for their cash and net assets. You could buy a stock for $10, and that share of stock would have behind it $10 in cash. Ideally, you would buy a stock for no more than 2/3 of its intrinsic value. That way you would have a margin of safety. A stock selling at 2/3 of its intrinsic value would have to be counted as depressed. It might not rise immediately from that discount from intrinsic value, but sooner or later it would have to. One might wonder why, if the market undervalues the issue at the time he purchases, it should not continue indefinitely to do so, and perhaps even increase the measure of undervaluation. There is no theoretical reason why these unpalatable results could not occur. The comfort and encouragement to the intelligent investor are to be found in practical experience. In the long run, securities tend to sell close to a price level not disproportionate to their indicated value. This statement is indefinite as to time. In some cases, the day of vindication has actually been deferred for many years. You can see why Benjamin Graham never sold like anyone can make $1 million,
Or how I made $2 million, and so on.
Telling a game player that he might make some money in 2 years is like betting him on how tall the corn will grow and then letting him sit on a camp chair in the cornfield watching it. And in the long run, Keynes said, we are all dead. Benjamin Graham would never buy a growth stock, or what has been recognized as the growth stock, because growth stocks seem to be betting on a future market judgment and the continuation of those growing earnings. The growth stock would not turn out to be one after all, and one has only to look at the growth stocks of the 50s, chemicals and aluminums, to realize that growth in many, probably most, companies is not a permanent stage, but a dramatic burst in early adolescence. But of course, in other instances, growth was quite real. Not only would Benjamin Graham have steered clear of IBM in 1949,
he would have avoided it at any time.
And IBM has been the source of many fortunes. The same could be said of Xerox, Polaroid, and innumerable other growth companies. They simply do not look like the value is there. It is certainly not there in assets, related to market value. It may be there in patent protection or reputation, but how do you measure that? Money has been lost in growth companies which stopped growing, and at market peaks, it has been possible to pay too much for even the true growth companies. The growth companies rarely have the cash in the bank, and the more true the growth, the more they have deprived both their own current profits and current balance sheets to the benefit of some future payoff. And as the companies get more technical, the assessments become more difficult. Sperry Rand preceded IBM into computers, and American Photocopy preceded Xerox into copying, and it was possible to lose handsomely in either case. All you can say is that there are multiple theologies. Another of Graham's tests was the value to the private owner. Would a private purchaser pay the same price as the market? In depressions or market bottoms, a private purchaser could find great bargains that way. The rest of the time he would not pay cash in debt. There would be too much of a premium assigned by the market to future earnings, or goodwill, or a future buyer even more eager. The private owner would have to have supercurrency of his own, or not pay. In any case, the investor was to ignore the market, the current price quotation. He need pay attention to it and act upon it only to the extent that it suits his book, and no more. Thus, the investor who permits himself to be stampeded or unduly worried by unjustified market declines in his holdings is perversely transforming his basic advantage into a basic disadvantage. Price fluctuations have only one significant meaning for the true investor. They provide him with an opportunity to buy wisely when prices fall sharply and to sell wisely when they advance a great deal. At other times he will do better if he forgets about the stock market and pays attention to his dividend returns and to the operating results of his companies. Dividend returns? Dirty words to an aggressive investor in the 50s, and certainly to a swinger in the 60s. Happiness when stocks decline. And ignore the market? Not watch the tape? Not trade stories? Not press the buttons on the quote machine? Benjamin Graham was studied with respect by generations of analysts, but not with affection. What was one to do all day if the market was to be ignored? That would not get you rich. How could anybody ignore IBM? How smart could somebody be if he had missed IBM? Not because he didn't know about it, but because he had considered it, measured it, and turned it down.
Graham was well aware that he was himself selling at a discount from intrinsic value.
Through a number of editions of Security Analysis, the final sentence to the summary of the valuation of common stocks warned that our judgment on these matters is not necessarily shared by the majority of experienced investors or practicing security analysts. But the judgment was shared by one bright student. Warren sat in his bedroom office reading through the manuals, the statistical manuals of Moody's and Standard & Poor's. There are all the statistics, the balance sheets, the debt, and the contingent reserves, and slumbering on the forest floor, if you could but recognize them, were the truffles. I always knew I was going to be rich, Warren said. I don't think I ever doubted it for a minute. There was Western Insurance earning $16 a share and selling at $16 a share. There was National Insurance selling at 1 times earnings. How could it miss? Warren wrote to his partners every year, and what he wrote was in line with the teachings of Benjamin Graham. I cannot promise results to partners, he wrote, every year. What I can and do promise is that A. Our investments will be chosen on the basis of value, not popularity. B. Our patterns of operation will attempt to reduce the risk of permanent capital loss, not short-term quotational loss, to a minimum. And C.
My wife, children, and I will have virtually our entire net worth in one partnership.
The foundations of the operation were almost straight from Graham. Never count on making a good sale. Have the purchase price be so attractive that even a mediocre sale gives good results. There is this about Graham. If you have bought at less than true value, if you have a comfortable margin of safety, you are going to sleep better. Then, as the stock starts to work its way up from the discount from its intrinsic value to that value, you will have a gain. And when gains compound, you do very nicely. Warren's letters to his partners usually carried a small table to show how compound interest, the growth of money from the increment, can grow.
Here is a compound interest rate table showing the gains from $100,000 compounded at various rates.
Now you can do better than 4% at a savings bank, and a 16% gain, 2 points on a 10-point stock, and pay the taxes, does not seem unusual as a goal. But look what happens toward the right-hand corner. It is hard to believe that the professional managers running hundreds of millions in the late 60s ever looked at such a table, or they would not have been able to declare confidently that they expected to do 20% a year. 80 times the original stake is better than any professional I know has done with other people's money in the last 30 years. The point is that a 16% compound can be a pretty exciting figure. Over a long enough period of time, the effect of compounding can be a bit ridiculous, and you can play any historical game you want. The Manhattan Indians sold their island to Peter Minute in 1626 for $24. Who got the better deal? Well, at $20 a square foot,
Peter Minute's island is now worth $12.4 billion.
Could the Indians have gotten 7%?
They now would have more than $225 billion.
And they would be 20 times better off. Or take Francis I, the French Francis I, who is reported to have paid 4,000 écus for a painting called Mona Lisa.
Local scholars translate that écu rate out at about $20,000.
Had Francis been able to find, in 1540, a 6% after-tax investment, his estate would be more than $1 trillion, a quadrillion 3,000 times the U.S. national debt. Try that on your art dealer the next time he says art is a hedge against inflation. You do have to have a very long life in order to enjoy the greatest benefits of the compound table. Warren wrote them up for his partners to illustrate the enormous benefits produced by relatively small gains in the annual earnings rate. Every percentage point of investment return above average has real meaning.
Warren had a relative, not a finite goal from the beginning of the partnership.
It was to beat the Dow Jones averages by 10 percentage points a year. If the market was up 20%, the partnership should be up 30%. If the market was down 30%, the partnership should be down only 20%. Because of the investment approach, it would be easier to beat the Dow in a down market than in an up market, which was the reverse of the very aggressive so-called swinging managers. The record demonstrates that, in the 5 years that the Dow was down, the partners were up, and the Dow was comfortably beaten by 10 percentage points, except for 2 years in which that average was up rather sharply. All through the 60s, Warren stayed away from the stocks that dominated the financial headlines and provided the excitement in the boardrooms. The partners bought an old textile company called Berkshire Hathaway, because its net working capital was $19 a share and their cost was about $14. They ended up owning most of the company, and Warren put new management in. While Berkshire is hardly going to be as profitable as Xerox, Fairchild Camera, or National Video in a hypertensed market, it is a very comfortable sort of thing to own. We will not go into the businesses where technology, which is way over my head, is crucial to the decision. In some of the partnership's investments, the partnership did end up controlling the company. A second category was workouts, that is, situations in which a merger or reorganization has already been announced. Usually, the market has recognized the first 95 cents on the dollar in such a case, but even the last 5%, 2 or 3 times a year,
on an annualized basis, builds up to a respectable compound.
The major category of the partnership's investments, however, were in the undervalued category. Here the market was ignored, unless it was presenting something at an unusual price. Benjamin Graham had instructed his students to think of themselves in partnership with a Mr. Market. Every day Mr. Market tells you what he thinks the business is worth. Some days Mr. Market is feeling very optimistic and is willing to offer you much more than your share of the business is worth. Some days he is very depressed,
and he is willing to sell you his share for less than it is worth.
All you have to do is know what the business is worth. Ben was right, Warren said. The market is a manic depressive. That's why you can't buy and sell on its terms. You have to buy and sell when you want to. After a while, around Warren, you begin to get a feel for business, as opposed to stocks moving. We are driving down a street in Omaha, and we pass a large furniture store. I have to use letters in the story because I can't remember the numbers. See that store, Warren says? That's a really good business. It has a square feet of floor space. does an annual volume of B, has an inventory of only C, and turns over its capital at D. Why don't you buy it? I said. It's privately held, Warren said. Oh, I said. I might buy it anyway, Warren said, someday. That phrase, that's a good business, I heard several times, always applied to something solidly managed with a secure niche, plenty of capital and a respectable return on invested capital. Sometimes it was the ethnic banks in Chicago, which have 40 or 50,000 passbook savers so loyal they will drive for miles even after they have moved away from the neighborhood. Sometimes it was a Tennessee or Illinois bank that simply earned a very respectable return. One example can serve very well in this idea of the undervalued stock. In the first part of the 1960s, American Express was involved in the financing of some salad oil that turned out not to exist. A number of institutions were badly hurt, and several Wall Street houses whose commodity departments had participated went broke. American Express was sold from a high of 62 3/8 in 1963 down to 35. American Express. The name only is a great franchise, Warren said. He went into Ross's Steakhouse in Omaha and sat behind a cashier to see how many American Express chits showed up after dinner. He made a tour of the Omaha banks to see whether the scandal had affected confidence enough to discourage the sale of American Express traveler's checks.
American Express had over 80% of the traveler's check market nationally, and nothing could shake it.
Warren bought American Express at its darkest hour, and in fact the partnership owned 5% of the company at one point.
Amex went from 35 to 189 in the following 5 years.
The same reasoning went into Disney in 1966. Disney was selling at about $50 a share.
On that basis, the whole company was selling for $80 million.
But Snow White, Bambi, and all those other cartoons
Had been written off of the books.
They alone were worth that much. You had Disneyland to boot, and Walt Disney as a partner for nothing. While Warren bought Disney for its basic value, the market picked it up and carried it into the leisure boom. And while Warren's reasoning was from Graham, both Disney and American Express were soon to be growth stock favorites. If the stock doesn't work in one context, sometimes it works in another. Sometimes the conglomerates would come along and bid for one of our asset value plays. By 1967, Warren was beginning to think that maybe he would not run the partnership forever. He was, of course, less hungry, but also, as he wrote to his partners, I am out of step with present conditions. When the game is no longer being played your way, it is only human to say the new approach is all wrong, bound to lead to trouble, and so on. On one point, however, I am clear. I will not abandon a previous approach whose logic I understand, although I find it difficult to apply, even though it may mean foregoing large and apparently easy profits to embrace an approach which I don't fully understand, have not practiced successfully, and which, possibly, could lead to substantial permanent loss of capital. Warren cut the expectations of his partners by about half. Philosophically, I am in the geriatric ward, he wrote. We live in an investment world populated not by those who must be logically persuaded to believe, but by the hopeful, credulous, and greedy, grasping for an excuse to believe. Those were the times when fund managers expected to do 30% a year, and when 100% gain could be expected in a computer stock, a franchising chain, or a pastel of nursing homes. A leading investment manager of $1 billion fund had delivered himself of a statement that money management was a full-time job. Not only week by week and day by day, securities must be studied on a minute-by-minute program. Wow, Warren wrote, this sort of stuff makes me feel guilty when I go out for a Pepsi. Many investment funds far outperformed both the Dow and the Buffett partners in the heady atmosphere of 1967 through 68. Most of them gave much of it back the following years. The Buffett partners were up again in 1969 against a loss of 6% or so in the Dow. But Warren was through. The ideas were coming harder. In retrospect, Warren said, maybe a convulsive period like the 30s provided Ben with his environment. A period when securities are really unpopular leaves a lot of bargains to be discovered. But for almost 30 years now, people have been combing and recombing, and I'm not sure how many bargains remain. There will be some from time to time. But now there are so many security analysts, even though most of them are wedded to other theories, the ranks of security analysts have really multiplied in one generation. There was yet another difference brought by changing times. Graham had originally divided his investors into aggressive and defensive. The defensive or passive investor was concerned with maintaining his principal and securing a return on it. The aggressive investor was to be rewarded for his attitude toward risk. If the defensive investor could expect, say, 4.5% return, then the aggressive investor would expect 9%. Presumably, the defensive investor would be in a combination of bonds and solid stocks, and the aggressive investor in undervalued situations. But over the years, bond yields rose and the possibility of stock gains declined, closing the gap. The Fortune 500, Warren said, yields about 11% as a return on its own invested capital. If you paid out half and reinvested half, the return to an investor in the 40% bracket would be 6 to 7%, and you can get that in a tax-free municipal. There's no question that the Ben Graham approach was evolved in another era and designed for that time. Corporate managers in the 30s and 40s did not fear inflation. They feared going broke. They wanted a cushion against adversity, and sometimes that impulse led them to piling up cash far beyond their needs. Rather than reporting not only all their earnings, but even earnings they did not have, as became the fashion in the 60s, they actually hid their earnings through a variety of devices and reserves, so that they would have something for the lean years. Now corporate managers, fearing inflation and also wanting to look good on quarterly earnings basis, leveraged their companies. Meanwhile, conglomerates already leveraged sought out the remaining cash-rich companies. So there is not as much Graham material around as there once was, and yet the market does provide it from time to time. Warren introduced me to another Graham disciple. He has no connections or access to useful information, Warren wrote. Practically no one in Wall Street knows him, and he is not fed any ideas. He looks up the numbers in the manuals and sends for the annual reports, and that's about it. He is a very family-oriented fellow. He probably spends more time thinking about children than about stocks.
There followed a list of stocks,
about half of which I had scarcely heard of. The Rutland Railroad, the New York Trap Rock Company, the Union Street Railway of New Bedford, Jeddo Highland Coal. Clearly the fellow had never been to lunch at Scarsdale Fats, and was probably not around after the close at Oscar's. The record was not spectacular. It plodded away, beating the Dow Jones average by a few percentage points, not as wide a margin as the Buffett partners, but up 17% compounded over 15 years. I made a lunch date with Herbert. We stopped at the check room with his raincoat and briefcase. He waited until the briefcase was stashed away. You couldn't, he said, be too careful. I didn't get to go to college, Herbert said. I went to work in the Depression because my folks didn't have any money, and I worked as a runner on Wall Street and then in the cage, tallying stocks. Herbert took a Graham course at night at the Institute of Finance. Ben really loved to teach, he said. He could have made a lot more money if he hadn't been so interested in teaching. Herbert operated just as Warren said he had. He never looked at rising stocks. He looked at the list of new lows in the paper every day. Look at the steels, he said. No one wants them. Will they go bankrupt? How can an industrial country not have a steel industry? Look at American Can under 30. Can they keep that dividend? I'm not very bright, Herbert said. I can't compete with all the bright people, and especially the ones who have college educations, who have been to business school, who have lots of corporate contacts. I don't know anybody. I have to buy what I'm comfortable with. These fellows that buy, even Procter & Gamble and General Electric, why? Those stocks go up and down all the time. I just wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I owned stocks like that. What was Herbert buying? Well, there's one issue of Penn Central bonds, Herbert said. That was a bit breathtaking. The Penn Central is very busted. The Pennsylvania Railroad is bankrupt, I said. The value of the stock is negligible. The value of the bonds is questionable. It will take 20 years to straighten out. What you should buy is Sherman and Sterling, the lawyers, who will get all the money for the next 20 years. I know, Herbert said, but there is one issue of Penn Central bonds that is collateralized by the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad. I wrote Irving Trust and asked them, did they have the collateral behind the bonds, and they said yes. They don't pay interest on the bonds, but when they settle the case, I think they will. And meanwhile, the interest is in a special account at Girard Trust, 12, 13, 14%. It may take a long time, but I can sleep at night. I'm not in a hurry. Things always take longer than you want them to.
Had he really owned the Union Street Railway of New Bedford?
Oh yes, they had a lot of cash. It took quite a while to liquidate, but it worked out very, very well. Warren bought a weekly newspaper in Omaha, where he seems to be as popular as the Cornhuskers' winning coach. He also bought part of the Washington Monthly, a small circulation magazine on political affairs.
He is interested enough in newspapers to have made a bid for the Cincinnati Enquirer.
Considering the Cornhuskers' background and his father's service as a Republican congressman, it is a mild surprise to find him a Democrat.
And in fact, a number of Democratic hopefuls have found their way to Omaha
to talk about issues and the future. Warren says he has no political ambitions.
Most of the millions amassed by the Buffett Partnership
will go to a foundation, because there is no point in ruining the lives of children at Central High, by leaving them an uncomfortable amount of money. We had a long discussion one night about the uses of money. What would you do with $25 million, he asked, for he said, everything he wanted. The house was enough house, and Central High was good for the kids. He didn't like travel. He might be uncomfortable where they didn't speak English. He wanted to do things in the public interest, but while the problems had been well articulated, there were no great original solutions. One thing he did in Omaha was to join the Jewish Country Club. I ate lunch in the Omaha Club, that's the downtown club, and I noticed there weren't any Jews, Warren said. I was told they have their own club. Now there are Jewish families that have been in Omaha 100 years. They have contributed to the community all the time. They have helped build Omaha as much as anybody, and yet they can't join a club that John Jones, the new middle-ranked Union Pacific man, joins as soon as he's transferred here. That is hardly fair. So I joined the Jewish club. It took me 4 months. They were a little put back and confused, and I had to do some convincing. Then I went back to the Omaha Club and told them that the Jewish Club wasn't totally Jewish anymore. I got 2 or 3 of the Jewish Club members to apply to the Omaha Club. Now we've got the thing cracked. In introducing me to Herbert, Warren had also, to my mind, described himself. He never forgets, he said, that he is handling other people's money, and this reinforces his normal strong aversion to loss. He has total integrity and a realistic picture of himself. Money is real to him and stocks are real, and from this flows an attraction to the margin of safety principle. After our Omaha session, I participated in a seminar with about 20 leading money managers. I brought up Graham.
That old stuff, said one of the managers.
Graham is all right, but it's really just a lot of platitudes interspersed with 40-year-old industrial gossip. Then, after this particular 4-day seminar, I reported the discussion on Graham to Warren. He took it for granted that Graham would be, as it were, selling at a discount, but his loyalty was undiminished. Graham's teachings, he wrote, have made a number of people rich, and it is difficult to find any cases where those teachings have made anyone poor. There are not many men you can say that about. Chapter 11. The Debased Language of Supercurrency. When Benjamin Graham was not communicating in Latin or Greek, he depended on 2 other languages, English and numbers. The numbers, income statements, balance sheets, told you how a business was doing, what its strengths and weaknesses were, and what its characteristics were. In short, they were a mirror of activity. A good analyst could look at a cash flow sheet like Toscanini looking at a score. Beautiful, beautiful. Tum-tum-de-tum. Wait, where are the flutes? Tum-tum-de-tum. Flutes? But when Toscanini looked at the score, he could make certain assumptions. If the score said C sharp, that meant it was a C sharp, whether played by a flute or a tuba. Beethoven did not put into the score
C sharp, except that the composer has elected to defer certain notes,
and to leave some out because this year they do not sound so good. We should have 3 good flute players by this time next year. See footnote 13. And counsel believes the composer has a meritorious defense, and nothing will have a material effect on this melody except maybe. Investors now have a problem that is more severe than in the days when Benjamin Graham would take his students through a balance sheet. The numbers may or may not mean what they say, and there is a crisis in the language. The power of the supercurrency is so strong and its rewards are so great that numbers go into constructing the best supercurrency picture and not necessarily into mirroring activity. There are all sorts of students of the marketplace, and numbers of differing portfolio strategies. Let us take one of the most deceptively simple, which is to look for growing earnings. The first thing to cheer your heart, if you are a growth fan, would be a neat stepladder earnings pattern. 1965, 0.93. 1966, 1.25. 1967, 1.49. 1968, 1.68. 1969, 2.08. 1970, 2.40. 1971, 2.71. Beautiful, beautiful, what harmony. That happens to be Xerox, which made a lot of people a lot of money. In the old days, some investors did not want small companies which might or might not grow up to be Xerox. These small companies needed all the cash they could generate, so they did not pay dividends. Some investors wanted dividends. Pension funds did not even keep large percentages of stocks in their portfolios. They bought bonds. They knew the interest rate on the bonds, and that the bonds would pay the interest for many years, and that would take care of the pensioners when they retired. But gradually, as a small growing company kept growing, more conservative investors became interested. A bank trust department here and there would nibble. A mutual fund might buy some. Not only would the earnings keep growing, but the premium that people would pay would grow. The adventurous investor would take the early risks, and then sell to the more prudent investor who required more convincing. Then two things happened. One we have already seen in the history of the 60s. The prudent investors got just as aggressive as the old risk-takers. They did not wait for a stock to become a seasoned and proper and judicious fiduciary holding.
All of a sudden, there were 10,000 security analysts scouring the backwoods for those earnings patterns.
And 50,000 salesmen were eager to call everybody and tell them to buy. The second thing that happened was quite amazing. Growth? Is that what they want? Growth? Is that the highest price supercurrency? Is that how it's done? Wow. The supply of growth companies grew to meet the demand. Now, common sense, that great Yankee virtue, will tell you that there is one Xerox, not 17. But everywhere you looked, there was a company with a neat stepladder of growing earnings. Some of them kept the neat stepladder right up to the day they filed for bankruptcy. Skeptics can look at some of the popular institution holdings such as R-Ho, as well as the ones already noted on Babson's booby list. Magic. Growth companies everywhere. You want growing earnings? We got growing earnings. Make our stock go up, then all our stock options are worth a lot. Obviously, all the earnings were not growing like that, but did not the numbers imply precision? Did not the numbers then represent reality? They did not in many cases. The world is not the way they tell you it is. The numbers represented a lot of imagination at work in a popular arena. But you say this is business. You make a widget for X dollars and sell it for Y dollars, and in there somewhere is the profit, and then Price Waterhouse comes in and signs the statement. It says, "We have examined the books of Universal Widget, and they conform to generally accepted accounting principles."
Generally accepted accounting principles.
It is safe to say that for a generation no one knew what those 4 words meant. Leonard Spacek is a senior partner and chairman emeritus of Arthur Andersen and Company, one of America's Big 8 accountants. Here is Leonard Spacek on generally accepted accounting principles. How my profession can tolerate such fiction and look the public in the eye is beyond my understanding. I suppose the answer lies in the fact that if your living depends on playing poker, you can easily develop a poker face. My profession appears to regard a set of financial statements as a roulette wheel to the public investor, and it is his tough luck if he doesn't understand the risks that we inject into the accounting reports. That is the senior partner and chairman emeritus of one of the most prestigious accounting firms in the world. Everybody knows the odds on a roulette wheel. Translated even further, it means that if you see Universal Widget reporting $1 of earnings, that $1 can be 50 cents or $1.50, depending on which way they are playing the guitar that week. Where does all this flexibility come from? Well, you could change your depreciation from accelerated to straight line. If your depreciation charges are higher, then your profits are lower. So to increase profits, decrease depreciation. A couple of years ago, Armco Steel did just that. Its president, William Verity, said, "The move was a defensive ploy designed to get the stock up and out of the reach of asset-hungry conglomerates and other acquisition-minded folk. Of course, some future year your furnaces may be falling apart, and you without a cash reserve for new furnaces, but in the long run we are all dead. Let's get the stock up now. You can change the valuation of your inventories. You can adjust the charges made for your pension fund.
You can make a provision for taxes on the earnings of a subsidiary or wait until the subsidiary remits a dividend to the parent.
You can capitalize research instead of expensing it. You need not go as far as the gentleman at the United California Bank in Basel to avoid showing losses. There are legal means at hand.
You can defer the cost of a new project until that project brings in revenues.
If the project never comes off, you will take a bath some future year. There are in addition other discretionary expenses. There is a phrase for this philosophy. It is called après-moi le déluge, or as Scarlett O'Hara said, I'll worry about it tomorrow. If you do manage to get your stock up, you can go out and buy another company which has some assets and some earnings, but whose stock has not gone up.
Then you can play with pooling and purchase,
although not as much recently as in the good old days. With the newly purchased company tucked in, you can keep the game going. All of the devices described are generally done with an eye on the stock, not on what might be considered economic reality. The stock market cares about current earnings. They took our old, quiet system and ran it right into the ground. No one objects to a ruling, said James Needham, when he was an SEC commissioner, as long as it improves the earnings. If you touch the X-ray the other way, they scream.
Conversely, if you have a bad year,
if the write-offs begin to catch up with you, if your stock is down anyway, then you gather up all the sins you can find and lump them all into the bad year. This is called take-a-bath accounting, even by the accountants. The idea is that as long as your stock is down, you might as well get all the bad news for several years in each direction out of the way. Cancel the old option plan, vote new ones, and hope the stock will go up again next year. 2 notes before we take off on the accountants.
The first is that it is business itself that wants to write the books this way.
Accountants may sign the statements as independent professionals, but they want the accounts. That is how they make their living. So if you're an accountant and you choose not to go along with reporting all the income, but deferring all the cost, the businessman is likely to say, "Get lost. I'll get myself another accountant, a more cooperative one who understands me." This is called shopping for accounting principles. The second note is that once again, there are some honest men and some honest businesses. James Needham, who is an accountant as well as a former SEC commissioner, and who is now president of the New York Stock Exchange, said there were less than 50 serious errors in 9,000 statements filed with the SEC. Only 22 out of Fortune's top 100 companies, said he, showed discrepancies between what they reported to the public and what they reported to the SEC. Yes, there are differences. Companies report on 8K and 10K forms to the SEC, and on the grounds that the SEC needs more information than the public, the information may be not only more extensive, but different. The 8K form now requires that companies also report whether any change in the auditor has taken place, and whether that change involved a disagreement in accounting principles. The auditor who has been canned is supposed to say whether he agrees with the reason for seeking another auditor. That leaves the public with only 2 problems. 1, disputes are not likely to be carried as far as the SEC, and 2, the security analyst, much less the average investor, is hardly likely to spend his afternoons in the gloomy vaults of the SEC library. It is not easy to get 8K and 10K reports. The trouble with saying that most of the businesses report fairly is that it leaves the public with a question. Which are the ones that don't? All the numbers look alike, and it requires a full-time professional accountant to ferret out all the nuances. It was not always this way. That is, there was not always this attention to hyping up current income. A generation ago, it used to be the other way around. There were far fewer stockholders, and the stockholders were much more likely to know the business, perhaps even to control it, and hence to know the auditors. Management liked to pile up cash as a reserve against leaner years. They did not want to report income. The stock market was sleepy. Besides, the stock market valued assets and dividends, not reported income. If you reported big profits, your unions would ask for more money. The taxman would ask for more money. Your shareholders would expect a bigger dividend. Gradually this changed. The Internal Revenue Code of 1954 had some regressive features. tax shelters, investment credits, declining balance methods of depreciation. Labor unions stopped looking at the published data and based their demands on what they could get, not on what the figures showed might be a slice of the pie. For the most part, they got much of what they asked for, and the corporation simply raised its prices, and we were on the way to cost-push inflation. Shareholders began thinking that if you could get the stock to go up by plowing the dividend money back in, dividends were for old ladies. The corporation discovered that the more it borrowed, the higher the earnings and the higher the stock, so it began to leverage. The trend finally culminated in the late 1960s when conservative managements were punished for their conservatism. If you carried your patents at zero, if you had written off everything and piled up the cash, if, in short, you had built up your assets, you were vulnerable to a company with no assets and a fast-moving, high-priced stock. Your own stock would have a one-shot jump when the offer would be made, but then you would be swallowed up into the company with the sexy paper, and history was to prove that those companies were ranking members of the booby list in the decline. Asset-rich insurance companies were a favorite target. Thus Liasco took over Reliance Insurance. National General took over Great American, and so on. LTV, the vehicle of Jimmy Ling, took over the famous old packing firm of Armour, and the famous old steel company of Jones and Laughlin, in the famous redeployment of assets on the way to its troubles. Not all managements liked the trend, but once it got going, few were strong enough to buck it. I wish to hell the stock market didn't want to see the earnings go up all the time, the chairman of a hotel chain told me. Business just isn't like that. Every year is not always bigger than the last year, and we have to bend things around a lot to get them to come out right. Why not report it the way it is? Then the stock would go down, and we'd be at a disadvantage
vis-a-vis our competitors in hiring executives,
making new hotel deals, and so on. If you could get everybody to go along at the same time, we'd do it. Some people began to suggest that maybe reported profits weren't the way to measure a company. Perhaps it should be cash flow or return on investment. The worst sandbagging for an investor came not necessarily when the numbers danced around before he bought. That was nothing compared to the bath handed to innocent investors when the numbers were changed retroactively. Universal Widget says it earned 50 cents in 1969, $1 in 1970, and $1.50 in 1971. You buy in, and then they tell you, sorry, we've changed our accounting. We didn't earn that at all. Put a little D in front of those numbers for deficit. Let not the investor take off an hour for lunch. By that time, the stock may have gone into one of those screeching dives that pulls out only at treetop level, a la Certainteed and F&M Schaefer. Shouldn't the investor get the same information as the SEC? Some of the accountants think that too much information would confuse the poor fellow. Philip DeFleiss, the managing partner of Lebrand, Ross Brothers in Montgomery, one of the Big 8 accounting firms, said thus, "Would you want things like maintenance and repairs in every annual report, or rents and royalties? A layman has access. He can go to a library. Most business libraries have these things. Or his broker can get them for him. If a man is going to invest and do a research job, then he should be doing the same kind of job the analyst is doing. As sophisticated investors got bagged, some of them began to take shots at the accountants. Did not Pete Marwick certify the Penn Central? Was not the distinguished name of Price Waterhouse on Minnie Pearl's fried chicken, later Performance Systems, later busted? Was not that Arthur Young's name on Commonwealth United? Did not the New York Stock Exchange itself sue Haskins and Sells, another Big 8 accountant, for certifying the busted New York Stock Exchange firm of Orvis Brothers? What did it mean to have a distinguished accounting name on reports? Nothing, said Thornton Oglove, an accountant who writes a newsletter on accounting for a Wall Street firm. The signature is worthless. That is pretty strong stuff. So one does have to remember that the majority of companies play it quite straight. For those interested, there are articles galore. I have used some of them here, in the Financial Analyst Journal, in the accounting magazines, and in Barron's and Forbes. John Childs of Irving Trust has written a very expensive, technical, and complete little book called Earnings Per Share and Management Decisions. The ultimate responsibility in all of this was given by Congress to the SEC. Here is part of Section 19 of the original Securities Act of 1933, worth recalling just for the majesty of the Old Testament prose. It's also worth recalling that the title states, "An act to provide full and fair disclosure." The italics are mine. The Commission shall have authority from time to time to make, amend, and rescind such rules and regulations as may be necessary to carry out the provisions of this title, including defining accounting, technical, and trade terms used in this title. Among other things, the Commission shall have authority, for the purposes of this title, to prescribe the form or forms in which required information shall be set forth, the items or details to be shown in the balance sheet and earnings statement, and the methods to be followed in the preparation of accounts, in the appraisal or valuation of assets and liabilities, in the determination of depreciation and depletion, in the differentiation of investment and operating income, and in the preparation of consolidated balance sheets or income accounts. The Commission or any officer or officers designated by it are empowered to administer oaths and affirmations, subpoena witnesses, take evidence, and require the production of any books, papers, or other documents which the Commission deems relevant or material to the inquiry. So that is where the ultimate authority lies.
But the SEC, whose payroll is an infinitesimal percentage of that of the CIA, could not possibly police all of American business.
It bounced the reporting responsibility to business itself and to the accounting profession. But is accounting a profession? Could one be disbarred or tossed out for malpractice? For whom does the accountant work, the investor or the management? Most important, is there any consistency in reporting? In 1938, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants set up a committee on accounting procedure to narrow the areas of difference in corporate reporting. In 1959, it set up the Accounting Principles Board to succeed that committee. The proponents of uniformity question whether any investor can make a decision when all the numbers are so different. How can the same Boeing 727 be depreciated over 10 years by one airline and over 16 by another? The defense says that it's management's prerogative to decide, that accounting is an art, not a science, and too much rigidity wouldn't be good either. The Accounting Principles Board put a committee to work on the metaphysical questions of accounting. What is economic reality? What is current value? What is fair value on a balance sheet? What should the objectives of financial reporting be? Can accounting provide what is needed? Should there be industry standards with the discrepancies reported? Do differing circumstances justify the discrepancies? The sway of the Accounting Principles Board is far from firm even within its own profession, and it remains to be seen whether the clients will go along. Each reforming rule is greeted with squawks from the owners of various gored oxen, and in fact, early in 1972, the Accounting Principles Board was sandbagged by its own clients when Congress passed an investment tax credit. Industry went in and lobbied for that credit to be allowed as a one-shot, one-year boost to profits. The accountants wanted the credit spread over the life of the equipment, and they were easily beaten. That dispute was followed by one over full-cost accounting in the oil industry. We need not go into the harrowing details. Full-cost accounting, said Stanley Porter, a partner of Arthur Young and Company, and author of a book on petroleum accounting, would produce instant earnings for those companies that adopted it, and leave the more conservative companies facing the erosion of their investment standing by comparison. Yet full-cost accounting spread like the Dutch elm disease. Within months, the Accounting Principles Board was just about out of business. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants was devising another body, a Financial Accounting Standards Board, to replace it, which would include some non-accountants and which might be full-time and professional.
So the whole business is still enveloped in clouds of dust.
What is the investor to do? Short, of course, of getting the attention of his congressman,
Itself hardly likely, since accounting is rarely one of the gut issues in an election.
I asked the question of many of the concerned people. Professor Abraham Brilloff of the City University of New York thought accountants should subscribe to a Nuremberg Code and should refuse to carry out orders that were improper or morally wrong. One member of the Accounting Principles Board said to me, "We are the establishment, and if we do not work quickly to change things, the whole thing is going to come down." David Knorr, a Wall Street member of that board, wrote, "Accounting today permits a shaping of results to attain a desired end. Accounting as a mirror of activity is dead. Even the legal profession is weary. lest generally accepted accounting principles not represent full enough disclosure. The review of securities legislation, citing SEC v. Banger Punta Corp., U.S. v. Simon, and Gersel v. Gamble Skogmo, warned,
Counsel must beware of blind reliance on the adequacy of financial statements,
both as a whole and in particulars. There are many situations in which such statements, even though competently and carefully prepared, and in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, must be supplemented extensively lest the statements themselves become instruments of deception. Still another board member worried that Ralph Nader and the forces of consumerism might seize the issue, although he said, the public itself doesn't give a damn. The public is a greedy lot. Give them 2 years of good market and they'll be back. Another professor of accounting wanted the professional consumers of the financial information, institutions and their analysts, to refuse to buy the production until standards were satisfied. The charges of the critics still echo, and they include such phrases as fiscal masturbation,
massaging the numbers, and corporate fandangles. The head of one of our major drug companies put it quite succinctly.
One good accountant is worth 1,000 salesmen, and yet, all of these exceptions take for granted that there is truth and it can be made to work. Even the accountant's critics can sometimes see progress,
though they then say it's not fast enough.
If you look to Europe or Japan, the accounting is nowhere near as full nor as precise. In Britain, whence much of contemporary accounting grew, some of the work done is even better, but it is done on British companies with their own sets of problems. Accounting should chart the ebb and flow of activity so that non-accountants can take it for granted. It is scarcely fair to ask everybody to be an accountant, yet the way things are, few investors will be able to unravel the nuances themselves. The accounting profession should earn the investor's confidence, but in the meantime, an individual investor has to get help from the brokers who get commissions from him. Somewhere in the brokerage firm there have to be sophisticated buyers of information. You can, of course, get the annual report and throw the thing away if there are 15 footnotes, or if the notes are incomprehensible. Ultimately, there is only one defensive quality that can serve as protection, and that is common sense.
Does it really make sense to believe that this cigarette company is increasing its earnings 30% a year? Does it make sense to believe that in an industry as easy to enter as Shell Homes, this producer is going to continue earning 50% more every year? If the company is in a number of different businesses, did it really generate the earnings, or did it buy them, or did it borrow them? There are enough things to worry about in life already, but there is no choice but to say, be skeptical and on your guard. Chapter 12. Co-opting some of the supercurrency. All right, the numbers dance around sometimes, but it is the only wheel in town. You still need some of the M3 because it is so much higher octane than M1 and M2. What we all should have done was to find a grandfather who sold his ratchet company to that great fount of supercurrency, IBM. Then all this would be academic. Granddad's ineptness we can lament, and it is hard to create supercurrency because you have to go through the whole diaper stage with a new company. And we are not going to get in on the first batch of freshly baked supercurrency in each company because that is when the insiders sell to the outsiders, and we are outsiders. But at some stage we must successfully co-opt some of the stuff just to get out of the prole ranks of the M1s. Maybe we can just buy something that will go up a lot. After all, a $5,000 investment in Avon products in 1950 would have grown to $2.3 million, roughly, today. And $5,000 in the Haloid company that year would today be Xerox, and about $3 million. You only have to find one such plum. Is that still possible for an individual? If you ask this question inside the securities business, you get two answers. The first is from the New York Stock Exchange and the retail firms who have many branch offices and deal directly with the public. They say that the public has equal access to information, and that individuals have invested successfully for years and will continue to do so. The second answer comes from the investment professionals, who think the day of the individual investor is over. There used to be individual investors in mortgages, one said. Your grandmother might have held a mortgage on somebody's house.
A mortgage on a house maybe in another town, brought to her by a mortgage broker who knew she was looking for an income. That doesn't go on anymore. Earlier, we looked at a convulsive period for the whole structure. The banking system that absorbed a run-on commercial paper, and the investment community which absorbed barely the collapse of undercapitalized brokerage firms. It survived. The structure shuddered a lot but stayed intact and has now been bolstered. Within the structure, however, changes continue to take place. Institutions continue to increase their share of the trading markets. Much of the public stock, remember, comes from the conversion of the family company to supercurrency, and that tends to stay locked up in trusts. Here is what has happened. The institutional share of trading, in average shares per day. 1952, 800,000. 1955, 1,300,000. 1960, 1,600,000. 1965, 3,500,000. 1971, 15,900,000. Plainly, the days of Mr. Smith in Portland, Oregon, selling to Mr. Jones in Portland, Maine, are mostly gone, and so is everything that went along with owning a share in America. In order to increase their share of the market, many small investors had to institutionalize their investing. When I think of the individual investor taking to the field these days, a quarterback called Harry Theophilides comes to mind. He comes to mind because a sports writer called William Wallace did a column about him. Otherwise, he would not come to mind. Harry Theophilides was 5'10". He played with the Redskins until Vince Lombardi came, but Lombardi was not about to have a quarterback who was only 5'10". Harry Theophilides was cut and went to the Jets, where he came off the bench in a game against the Giants, pumped the team to 3 touchdowns, including a couple of touchdown passes, and hit for something like 7 of 9 the following week against the Vikings. "Nobody ever beat me out," said Theophilides. He was cut for Al Woodall, who is 6'5", and went off to the Edmonton Eskimos in Canada. "Ever since I've been in football," Theophilides said, "somewhat bitterly, I've been told I'm too short, that I can't see over the defensive linemen. Well, who can? Defensive linemen, when they come at you with their hands up, they're over 7 feet tall. Nobody can see over them. You do a quick slide into the gaps between them, and then you look. Sonny Jurgensen told me he could never see. He just threw the ball where he thought the receiver ought to be." The individual investor has to be considered about 5'10" on the investment field, and there are a lot of other people out there who, with their research and their computers and their staffs, are over 7 feet tall with their hands up. The odds against a superior performance by an individual investor have to be considered to have gone up markedly since the people who are 7 feet tall with their hands up have come onto the scene. It was easy enough for Mr. Jones in one of the Portlands to sell quietly to Mr. Smith in the other one. They were at least the same size. Plainly, for a great number of investors, safety and a passive return are one course. The gap between the passive return, which doesn't want to accept risk, and the aggressive return, which will accept it, has narrowed considerably. The return from a tax-free municipal approaches the average return on the bulk of industrial stocks. Utilities, unexciting as a part of the game and facing financial problems, still are assured of revenue growth. Some of them have partially tax-free returns and have a tradition of increasing their dividends every year. A second course is to buy the so-called great companies and not sell them. This is the course of the University of Rochester, which has had a remarkably successful investment portfolio. The university, being an institution, has a long time horizon. It is prepared to take the sudden downdrafts these stocks face in bad markets because it feels that over the course of a generation it will achieve a superior return. Rochester has large positions in Kodak and Xerox, both of which are in the university's backyard, and some which were given to it. The individual still faces the question, what is a great company? Because great companies become mature and not so great, early growth is an invitation to competition, and the growth companies of one era are not always those of the next. Nonetheless, it is possible, by concentrating on some of the characteristics below, to find companies which can be held for a long time. Both of these courses assume the ability to leave the game element behind, entertaining as that may be. Finally, a minority of individuals,
Those with some time and the proclivity to do their own work can do very well.
For the people who are 7 feet tall with their hands up are that way for everybody, even themselves, and nobody anywhere can see over them. You will have to take a quick step and look in the gaps between them. But a time may be coming in which it would be possible to be successful with just the old tenant that used to work. Anticipate the institutions. While institutions are big and muscular, their records are not all that awesome. Furthermore, their managers talk to each other and tend to run in packs, like beagles. All you have to do is find the scent before the beagles do. For institutions, too, have been burned. They love the security of a front-running company with growing earnings, and they are wary of small companies because they cannot move in and out of them well in size. If you can find the smaller, growing company and sell it to the institutions when it gets a bit bigger, you will have stepped into the gap between them.
That sort of front-running means the stock can go onto the approved list of the banks,
and a trust officer can put it into his accounts without being criticized. You will be, by now, paying some attention to the accounting, and you will be listening hardest to your own common sense. You will have husbanded your time and not wasted it on those industries, about 80% of them, that do not have favorable characteristics in the long term. Very likely, the company you find will be financially strong, so that it will not have to sell more stock or borrow unfavorably. It will have a leading edge in its key products and the capability of improving that edge through research if that is the way it's done. It will have control over its own prices and a labor component low enough not to be a problem, or at least controlled labor costs. It will be in an area that common sense will tell you is growing. All of these things will have contributed to its nice profit margins and its profits. All of these factors can be the ones to look for in finding something adolescent that is bought to be sold. If in addition, the company has something unique that makes competition difficult, you may have a great company that can be held.
In the 1960s, it was fashionable to look to high technology for all of these characteristics,
as well as for the something unique. Xerox and Polaroid were protected by rings of patents, but the lead time in patent protection is diminishing. If one polymer is patented, there may be a similar one which works equally well. Further, virtually everybody in the investment business underestimated how much the government flow of research and development money meant, even though the best of the pure companies, as the two above, were not dependent on that. In Avon products, it was the sales force that was so hard to duplicate. I have a bias about this particular philosophy, which you should correct for, because it is the one that served best when I was first learning. A bunch of us sat at the knee of one of the great apostles of the growth theory, a man who went out to the mutual funds and pension funds and preached the true gospel. Since then, we have learned that those growing earnings can be such a security blanket to the buyer that he pays too much for them. So even when the stepladder is true and the company is going to maintain the growth, it pays to buy them at the low end of the swings in their price-earnings ratios. Periodically, Mr. Market gets manic. A true growth company may swing from selling at 20 times earnings in a bad market
to 45 times in a hypertensed market,
and it does pay to wait for the troughs. Anyway, we sat at the great man's knee, and then we went out to apply the theory. We would wait tensely while the mentor graded our papers. I bring this up because I remember bringing in a stock that provides the perfect example of what an individual can do by himself. The mentor had bid us study Gillette. The mentor held up a pack of blue blades, very dramatic.
This will double, and if you know a double, you can do better than that.
People used up the blue blades, threw them away, and bought more. Gillette dominated its market with an army of salesmen. Its displays were on every drugstore counter, and it was going into other grooming items. What else was like Gillette? We were to go out scouting. I took a careful walk around a drugstore, and then I went to the manuals. And then I brought my stock to the mentor and waited for my very good grade. I had a stock called Tampax. It had no debt, no preferred, and plenty of cash. Its product was a leading product. It was like Gillette in that you used it, threw it away, and bought more. It had flexibility in the pricing. Its profits grew every year. I wanted an A for my idea. I got a B, and I protested. "It's a very good little company," said the mentor. "I suppose Kimberly-Clark or Scott could compete with it. But what is so unique? What is unique is that when people go to the drugstore, They don't know the name of any other product, I said. Like Kleenex. Tell me the name of what else competes with Kleenex. A generic name is better than patents. The mentor wouldn't change my B to an A. It's a solid B, he said, but the earnings grew perhaps 15% a year. We were looking at technological companies whose earnings grew 50% a year, making oscilloscopes and particle accelerators and other patented, super sophisticated stuff, protected by patents and by technical staffs with hundreds of PhDs in physics. Yours is a population growth stock, said the mentor. I don't see why it's ever going to grow considerably faster, although that 15% could compound. Texas Utilities and Coca-Cola increase their earnings every year, too. And those stocks are already on the approved list of all the banks. So I didn't buy Tampax at 5, adjusted for splits. The mentor was right for that time. The technology stocks moved much faster. A couple of years later, the pace accelerated, so that their patents were no protection. And then there was price cutting in some of the products. Some of those technological companies are far bigger today, and some are treated as cyclical companies. But Tampax is around 120. I feel dumb every time I think about it. There are numbers of other examples of front-running, solidly managed companies in growing fields with some sort of edge about them. Some of the ones that worked in the recent past were as easy to understand as Johnson & Johnson, Band-Aids, and baby powder, and McDonald's, the ubiquitous hamburger stands. MGIC, the Mortgage Guarantee Insurance Corporation, filled a conspicuous gap in mortgage insurance. Not only did these companies make it through the 60s and the Big Bear, but they are up better than 1,000% from their lows of a decade ago. That doesn't mean they are necessarily headed for that in the decade ahead. You have plenty of competition in looking for the outstanding steady growers. But you only need one for real success, and you can be sure that if you find one, somebody, a nice bank probably, will buy it from you at a premium some other time. Even if you are only 5'10" and the other fellows are 7 feet tall with their hands up. Chapter 13. Beta, or Speak to Me Softly in Algebra. There is no system in the market, and there are many approaches that work. The generation now in command has had just time enough to learn that at some point any of them can fail. It is a bright generation, so that discovery was damaging to its self-confidence. This generation entered the 60s full of beans. The generation ahead of them on Wall Street had clearly been paralyzed by the memory of the Great Depression. The new generation had moved in with the appropriate lack of inhibitions. The older generation had lacked real, serious security analysis. Now there were 10,000 security analysts. The older generation had relied on country club information and a few statisticians with green sleeve garters. Now there were computers to screen and filter, to assemble a stunning variety of comparisons and ratios, to do charts and measure relative strength. The financial rewards for the new generation were great, but that was only right and proper for gentlemen and ladies of business school education, rational intelligence, daring, and perception. Then along came a severe test, and took away not only some of the profits, but some of the scientific and self-confident aura of the whole business. The security analysts turned out to be just as wrong as they were right. Writing in the January-February 1972 issue of the Financial Analyst Journal, the director of research of a large institution assessed statistically the research which went to institutions. That is research presumably painstaking and not horseback, aimed at a sophisticated audience. The results weren't much different from the Standard & Poor's averages, and were summarized as consistently mediocre. Some were good, some were bad, and taken all together they weren't so handsome. The article may have been a bit unfair in that it was based on published material. The best work of the best security analysts goes unpublished. Analysts are paid indirectly with the commissions of clients, and those clients are quite likely to make up a list, a short list at that, of the analysts and the firms they want to reward. If an analyst has a bright idea, it is going to go first to his biggest client, and then to his next biggest, and so on. By the time it gets to the nth client, or into print, it has lost much of its value. But it is only from print that surveys and evaluations in the analyst journal can be made. Not only did the work of the security analysts follow the price of the stock more than the course of reality, but much of the technical apparatus also blew its tubes. The performance of the funds has already been discussed, and in aggregate, the performance of the managers left something to be desired. The more sensitive and alert money managers were the ones to engage in some self-questioning. Notes from portfolio manager seminars reveal a change in the tenor of the meetings over a course of 4 or 5 years. As the jackets came off and the drinks were poured in the earlier meetings, the questions ran too. All right, what's hot? What do we buy now? How long have we got? By recent times, the questions had taken on a Kierkegaardian tone, at least so far as this field is concerned, full of doubt and musings. What is a portfolio as opposed to a list of stocks? Can portfolios be managed as portfolios? Does anyone do it? What is a buy? What is a sell? Which one do you concentrate on? Can anyone outperform anyone else? What is risk? The last question got asked a lot after some of the portfolios went down 40%. After all, why pay a professional to lose 40% of your money? Maybe something was wrong with the whole process. Assessing where the economy was going, making some sort of market judgment, letting the security analysts scout their stocks, and building the portfolio, with the portfolio manager using his experience, judgment, rational intelligence, intuition, and fingerspitzengefühl. Maybe that was the wrong way. Maybe there was something missing from the process. Maybe that something was risk, the opportunity for loss. A headlong race to include the risk factor in all the calculations began, even though the professionals for years were accustomed to speak of the downside risk. But maybe you could quantify the risk, so that you wouldn't have to depend on the portfolio manager's judgment. Thus was born what came to be called the beta cult, after the Greek letter beta. Beta stood for the measurement of market risk through the variability of the rate of return, and thus could be considered a component in capital asset pricing theory. The beta cult gave Wall Street a new jargon to toss around. A dozen Wall Street houses offered beta measurement services, some taking full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times to announce their discoveries. The math and computer people had a quick resurgence, and some senior people growled, as did Lamont Richardson of Booz Allen. These people with math and computer backgrounds who think they can assign precise degrees of risk to 5 or 6 decimal places are nothing but charlatans. You have to start somewhere with beta theory, and the usual starting place is with the Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern of Princeton, published in 1944, which said, among other precepts, that in a game situation you had to calculate the risk accompanying the course to a particular reward, and to determine the utility of that course. In 1952, Harry Markowitz published a seminal article in the Journal of Finance, a version of his doctoral thesis at the University of Chicago. Markowitz showed that diversification could reduce risk, that you could measure the risk by measuring the variability in the rate of return, and that an efficient portfolio was one which provided the highest return for the amount of risk which the portfolio owner was willing to assume. For this, Markowitz was called the father of the beta. He now runs a small arbitrage fund that uses computer techniques but not much beta. At one beta seminar, Markowitz said that he was not the father of the beta, but the grandfather. That William Sharpe of Stanford was the father. The beta enthusiasm had one mildly amusing sidelight. All this statistical work, and the implication that some formula, however sophisticated, can in some way replace the manager, is naturally threatening to the manager. At a seminar 5 years ago, the Markowitz model, as it is called, was discussed for a whole morning. It was roundly denounced. Markowitz had missed the whole point of diversification. One participant even suggested, and this remains in the mimeographed abstract, that Markowitz's books be assembled and burned. But within 5 years, brokers, one of them represented at the seminar above, were offering beta studies to their clients as a merchandising come-on. Beta theory is based on 2 simple ideas. 1, that most stocks and groups of stocks bear a fairly close relationship to the market as a whole, and 2, that to get higher rewards, you have to take greater risks. The portfolio's riskiness is determined by plotting its rate of return, capital gains plus dividends, against the rate of return on convenient market index. say Standard & Poor's 500. The beta coefficient is the measure of volatility, the sensitivity of that rate of return to the market. By definition, the market has a beta of 1.0, so a portfolio of 2.0 would be twice as volatile. On the average, it would go down or up as much as the market. If you are wondering what happened to alpha, that is the residual influence not related to the market, the vertical axis against which the beta slope is plotted. Beta theory has provided a happy hunting ground for the type who love punching computer keyboards and desktop calculators, especially in academia. When the Financial Analyst Journal did a bibliography on risk and return, it listed, and this in 1968, 253 articles and 89 books. Those totals have now gone much higher. The big push for beta came from the banks, and specifically from the Bank Administration Institute. In the late 60s, the money was flowing out of bank trust departments and bank-managed assets and into performance funds and other forms of go-go. The people taking the money away were saying that the swingers were already up 50 and 100%, and that the bank-managed money hadn't moved in 10 years. The banks wanted some form of statistic that would say, sure, the gains are big, but look at the risks. The Bank Administration Institute put out a report measuring the investment performance of pension funds, which had a considerable impact. Further reports came out of the University of Chicago's Business School, long a fortress of stock market statistical work, shortly to be renamed Beta U, and Beta got a nod in the SEC's Institutional Investor Study. All of this work was directed simply at refining comparisons, so that you didn't take Fund A and compare its record with Fund B without also taking into consideration the volatility, and hence the risks, in each. If the so-called beta revolution is real and not just another statistical fad, then all comparisons in the future will have to contain beta adjustments. Mutual funds will disclose their beta assumptions, and incentive fees will be determined by incentive results adjusted by beta. Just so you know what they look like, here are medium, high, and low beta funds. Nice and easy, right out of the geometry books. Y equals A plus BX. There are, as you might have thought, still a lot of disagreements about beta. Does the variability of the rate of return really equal risk? Maybe that is only part of risk. Even if you can describe past portfolios with beta, does that help you build future portfolios? Price behavior may be people behavior, but people do not behave according to thermodynamic laws, said a Penn beta researcher, whose paper reported that beta worked on the New York Stock Exchange in wide swings of the market, but seemed to be useless on the American Stock Exchange. Back to the drawing board. Beta proponents say, sure, there are statistical biases, but they will be worked out imminently. There is no universal time series for beta. Beta might not work in portfolios with a short history, and could not some manager innocent of beta consider downswings as opportunity? One of the beta theoreticians, after a lot of calculator time, suggested that maybe risk and the opportunity for gain didn't come out quite as congruent as the first run-throughs suggested. Maybe the opportunities for greatest gain came in emphasizing the moderate risk course exclusively, and borrowing, if you could, to buy the moderate risk stocks. That, he suggested, was the most aggressive course possible. Thus did the statisticians arrive at what superachieving children do instinctively, for this is the statistical curve of the ring toss game charted by David McClellan, the Harvard psychology professor who was pioneered in measuring achievement. In The Achieving Society, McClellan noted that children with low achievement drives tossed the ring randomly, from any distance, but the high achievement children tossed from exactly that point that maximized not only their chances of success, but their satisfaction from it. It is a clean, dustless, fluorescently lit world, the beta world, full of the humming of computers. When the beta revolution arrives, you simply decide on the degree of risk you want and dial that. If you accept the idea, you dial a beta of 1.8 for high risk or 0.5 for low risk and go home. So do all the security analysts. The first step, said Professor James Lorry of the University of Chicago, is to give up conventional security analysis. Its occasional triumphs are offset by its occasional disasters, and on the average, nothing valuable is produced. The beta proponents are, by and large,
those who believe the stock market is a random walk, touched on in The Money Game, The Freshman Course, and earlier here. The random walkers believed that charts were a lot of nonsense because, in my own postulate, prices have no memory and yesterday has nothing to do with tomorrow. Yet so far, the triumph of beta has been to correlate all the yesterdays, and according to Chris Wells, author of a notable beta article, unlike chemical formulas, investment formulas, if they become widely accepted, tend to self-destruct by distorting the very environment from which they are derived. Underpinning the asserted need for and utility of such a system is the asserted futility of trying to outperform the market, which is itself based on the asserted efficiency of the securities market. The market is presumed to be efficient in the sense that, in general, the price of any security at any given time accurately reflects the best available information on that security. Such a degree of efficiency, however, would seem to presuppose a large number of very industrious security analysts. If all security analysts were sent off to school to become metal workers, the efficiency of the stock market would very swiftly decline. Then there would be a lot of information that wasn't being used, and the few remaining portfolio managers who signed up for beta could outclass the computers with their specific information. A couple of years ago, there was a flurry in the computer world about relative strength as a technique. All you had to do by definition was to stay in the strongest stocks, on the grounds that a stock is going up as long as it's going up. One of these was George Chestnut, who sold the service based on momentum, and whose American Investors Fund had risen 398.77% from 1959 to 1968. The machine does all the work, George said, raising both hands. Look, no hands. American Investors Fund went down 40% from December 1967 to June 1970. It had momentum, but it had too much beta, not enough alpha, and no soul. Conscientious fellow that I am, I have been to a number of beta seminars. Here are my notes from one of them. Any one security can have a substantial positive or negative alpha, and can have a fairly low rho. Rho is the correlation coefficient between the return on the stock and the return on the market. At this point I drew a ducky flying through the air. As we diversify, the portfolio's rho tends toward 100%, and alpha tends toward 0. I went up afterward to talk to our chief instructor. A colleague of mine passed me a note. Simulation does not prove that out, said the note. I drew a little ship on the water. With rho near 100% and alpha near 0, the portfolio's risk factors depend on its beta and on the overall market's average return, and standard deviation of returns. I drew 2 more duckies and wondered idly if I could get Teddy Kennedy to take the exam for me. A questioner in the audience had a question. Questioner: what happens if in the estimating equation for the beta you have misspecified so that you have serial correlation in the residuals? Moderator: what? Questioner: what happens if in the estimating equation for the beta you have misspecified so that you have serial correlation in the residuals? Panelist: I think I can handle that. It is not a serious problem. Questioner: but what if you do? Panelist: I have written a very complex paper which I am not sure I understand myself, and I can tell you it is not a serious problem. Moderator: does that answer your question? Questioner: no. What do you think of the market? I said. He looked at me like I was crazy. I had been reading a lot of the literature, so I may have looked a little addled. But I was longing for the good old simple days at Scarsdale Fats luncheons, with Scarsdale saying, "What 3 stocks do you like best?" and the money managers all hustling each other. So I repeated the question. He saw I meant it. "I have all my money in a savings account," he said. "Beta theory is going to be a useful tool. At least it is a handy way to describe some of the characteristics of a portfolio. Maybe it is going to be more than that. Some people take it very seriously. Maybe all the security analysts and portfolio managers will indeed go off to become metal workers. If not, beta will be integrated into the existing system, and you will get phone calls like this. This stock is selling at 36, and we think it could earn $3 easy. Keystone is looking at it very hard. The other stocks in the group all sell at multiples of 20 plus. And oh yes, it's got a beta of 1.6. That's pretty high, but this is a high beta market. Everybody's looking to juice up their betas. And before we know it, the accountants will get into the act and decide that according to generally accepted accounting principles, the stock has either a beta of 0.3 or 1.9, depending on which way you want to look at it, and we will all be back on safe, familiar ground. Even an elaborate quantification such as beta assumes that Monday will be pretty much like Friday, that the power will still be there for the computers, and the stock exchange will be humming along, its thoughts of moving to Dubrovnik merely a passing nightmare. But as that great social philosopher Satchel Paige once said, never look behind you, something might be gaining on you. What could that be? Well, watchman, what of the night? Arthur Burns's Angst. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Prince Valiant and the Protestant Ethic. Work and its Discontents. Will General Motors believe in harmony? Will General Electric believe in beauty and truth? Of the greening and bluing and Cotton Mather and Vince Lombardi and the growth of magic, and what is to be done on Monday morning? I think it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the snow was getting worse, and I began to ask myself what I was doing in the Pink Elephant Bar in Lordstown, Ohio. The Pink Elephant is on the highway, Route 45, and so is the 7 Mile Inn. And Rod's Tavern is just off the highway, and the highway is the one that goes by the new $250 million General Motors plant that makes Vegas on the world's most automated assembly line. My friend Bill and I go up, cold, to these various characters, some of them indeed with mustaches and long hair and sideburns, and there we are, boy social scientists, amateur pollsters. Can we talk to you? Can we buy you a beer? Rolling Rock or Genesee? Do you work in the Vega plant? Is that a good place to work? I mean, would you tell your brother or your son to get a job there? What do you do there? Does your wife work? Do you want another beer? When you get your paycheck, what do you spend it on? Do you spend it in stores for things, or do you pay it to people, doctors, barbers, plumbers? What do you think of the kids in the plant, the old guys, the blacks, the foremen, the management? Do you want another beer? What do you want to do with your life? At one point, this character in a leather jacket comes up behind us, who looks like an old pro football player gone a bit soft, not a tackle, a guard or a linebacker, maybe 6'3", 245, and he says, "I heard you talking." We wait, some tension in the air momentarily. "Are you from West Virginia?" We are not from West Virginia. Bill is from Detroit, and I am flown from the canyons of Gotham. "I knew you wasn't from here. You talk like you're from another country." "Well, yes, sir, I say it is another country." "Good, let me buy you beer. I like talking to people from other countries." "What do you make per hour? Would you rather have overtime or the time off? Is there a generation gap? Would you buy one of the cars you make? What does the union do for you? Why do you work there? What would you rather do? Do you think things are working properly in the country?" You can see all the contemporary social science bits going on. Attitude, authority, agree, disagree, sick society, attitude, work. Our ambitions are very modest. Bill is doing a story. Maybe he can get another Pulitzer. Why not have 2? And as for me, why, I am just looking for clues, see, the future of American capitalism. I am going through the money management macro bit in an untraditional way. The man running the money comes into his office, puts on his green eyeshade and his sleeve garters, and says, "How goes the world today? And how will it go in 6 months, a year?" But what does he know then? He reads reports and numbers. But what do they tell? I have just told you about some events in our recent history in which the system survived and some bright people failed. Are we really then back to normal? A big sigh of relief and business as usual? Or is there something else going on? Maybe the system is changing. Maybe our view of reality was distorted all the time. The very bright people were in charge of the government and making the world safe for democracy. And not only is the world not safe for democracy, it is not even safe in Central Park and downtown Detroit, and nobody wants to go out after dark. We put the money into public housing, and it turns into disasters such as Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, and 22 downtowns look like Berlin in 1945. We did put men on the moon, but do we really know how to manage and how to perform? The estimable white-haired and pipe-smoking chairman of the Fed, Arthur Burns, comes to report to the Joint Economic Committee of Congress. Clutched in his hand is the Fed's report for the year and its promises for the future. The report is all about the Fed's business, which is money and credit, and the estimable white-haired and pipe-smoking chairman says that the Fed is going to do everything just right. It is not going to let the recovery falter for lack of credit, nor is it going to put out so much credit that we will have another inflationary spiral. But before Burns delivers the report, he has to make some remarks that are not in the report. Maybe old-fashioned remedies. That is, those available to Arthur Burns. The levers of credit can't do the job. Businessmen aren't responding in the usual ways. Consumers aren't responding in the usual ways. Something has happened to our system of responses. Troubled times have left a psychological mark on people. Americans are living in a troubled world, and they themselves are disturbed. What can the matter be? Well, a long and most unhappy war, and busing, and the youth vote, and campus disorders, and urban race riots, and the fact that women also are marching in the streets. Oh my God, women are marching in the streets. If only life would quiet down for a while, said the chairman of the Fed. The classic economic policies would have a better chance of working. If only life would quiet down for a while. So said the chairman of the Fed, hardly one of your bomb-throwing radicals. Something has happened to our system of responses. If only life would quiet down for a while. Poor Arthur Burns. You press the levers and the right things don't happen, and the problem is life itself. But maybe that is life. Maybe that is the way things are going to be from now on. Good God, women marching in the streets, nobody responding in the usual ways. Mind-boggling. So that is one of the reasons I am getting a bit bloated on Rolling Rock beer in the Pink Elephant Bar on Route 45 in Lordstown, Ohio. The economists have made their usual cheery predictions. For the days when Keynes hoped that someday economists would be accorded the status of good dentists, and the analysts are off chasing the new nubile lovelies in a new game of Après Nuit, Le Déluge. But I do not have to show performance weekly or even quarterly, so I can take the time to worry these metaphysical questions that all the money folk will worry about some other time, that have Arthur Burns fingering his galusil. If you simply read the financial pages, you would find no hint of anything different. The typeface is the same, the language is the same, and the reports are all of prices. Bonds are up, the dollar is down, retail sales are up, sheer minutia. So everything is back to normal. We had a bad turn there at the end of the 60s. We had to hold our breath a little, but now we can go back to the old stand. Eisenhower is on the throne, the pound is worth a pound, and the bells ring out over the land on the 4th of July. From Time magazine on the 4th of July, 1955. From Franconia Notch, New Hampshire, to San Francisco, California, this week, there was clear and convincing evidence of patience, determination, optimism, and faith among the people of the U.S. In the 29 months since Dwight D. Eisenhower moved into the White House, a remarkable change had come over the nation. The national blood pressure and temperature had gone down. The nerve endings had healed. In and around the cities, bulldozers and pneumatic drills and rivet guns played an unending symphony of progress. At the office coffee breaks, talk was easy and calm, not about the coming war or the coming depression. Has the symphony of progress come back, or does Arthur Burns really have something to worry about? They say, for example, that the good old Protestant ethic has died away. Whatever happened to work? Doesn't anybody want to? And growth. The whole system is geared to growth. That is its justification. It works better. What is all this about no growth, zero population growth, zero economic growth? There is only so much stuff in and on the planet, and at the rate we are using it up in X years, there will be no planet. Apocalyptic literature arrives not only on the ecological side, but on the cultural side. The revolution of the 20th century will take place in the United States, writes a French critic, Jean-François Revel, and it has already begun. There is a revolution coming, writes Charles Reich. It will not be like revolutions of the past. It will originate with the individual and with culture, and it will change the political structure only as its final act. This is the revolution of the new generation. If any of this is true, we cannot simply go back to where we were. Radical change is very hard for most people to contemplate, and money managers are no different. Their attitude is, sure, changes. We sell something and we buy something else to fit the changes. You say work is going out of style? We'll buy play. Here are my 6 leisure time stocks. And let me tell you how long I've owned Disney. Money managers operate on the theory of displacement. The framework will be the same. But inside you moves things around. My favorite is a gentleman I ran into after I got back from the Vega plant. I told him that one problem among others in certain localities was dope addiction. And at one plant, though the number sounded very high to me, the rate was reported to be 14%. Well, he said, I haven't owned an auto stock for years, but 14%? Geesh, who makes the needles? The chairman was pleased to report sharply higher profits for the year due to increased sales of the entire line of hospital supply equipment. The reasons for the record profitability, said the chairman, were Medicare, Medicaid, and the sharply increased use of the company's new handy throwaway needle by the burgeoning heroin addiction market. Now it may be that displacement is all we have to consider. Ah, things are out. Quality of life is in. Back to the countryside. There is a waiting list for 10-speed bicycles. Who makes the 10-speed bicycles? Ah, the ecologists are gaining strength. Where is our list of water pollution companies? That is probably good thinking on the technical level. But there is also a strategic level, and the strategic level has to consider what the more profound changes are, and in fact it ought to, even without the rather parochial justification of buying and selling. So this is why I'm in Lordstown, just as one stop, looking for the sources of Arthur Burns' angst. Will life quiet down? In the automobile industry, to consider the parochial side for a moment, rewards and punishments are very tangible, and since the automobile industry is such a fantastic part of America, that would affect us all. General Motors, my God, nobody can comprehend the size of General Motors. It makes 1 out of every 7 manufacturing dollars in the country. Its sales are bigger than the budget of any of the 50 states, and of any country in the world except the United States and the Soviet Union. But even General Motors has problems. As Henry Ford II said, the Japanese are waiting in the wings. Someday, he said, they might build all the cars in America. The problem, or one of them, is that imports keep rising in spite of the theology of Detroit, which always maintained little cars, fa. Americans won't buy them. Americans want power, a sex symbol, racing stripes, air scoops for non-existent air, portholes for non-existent water. They want to leave 2 big black tire marks going away from the stoplight, rubber on the road. And the names went with the technology. Firebirds and Thunderbirds, Cougars and Barracudas and Impalas. Grrr, nothing about driving a handy little car there. So the handy little cars sold were foreign. Eventually, enough handy little cars were sold that the balance of payments continued in its sickening ways, and even Washington began to lean on Detroit. And Detroit figured, okay, we'll build a handy little car. General Motors was not about to have any more of the problems of urban Detroit. It put its $250 million Vega plant in the middle of an Ohio cornfield. And then this workforce showed up, the youngest workforce around, and look at them, hair down to the shoulder blades, mustaches, bell-bottoms, the whole bit. It looks like Berkeley or Harvard Square. It was a Ford official who wrote the following paragraph, but the same thing applies not only everywhere in the automobile industry, but probably in much of factory work. The memo is from an industrial relations man to his superiors, and he is talking about the present and the future. This gentleman is nobody's fool, and his memo should be in the sociology texts, not in the filing cabinets. The memo was Xeroxed, and a friend of mine got a Xerox and Xeroxed it again, so I have one, and I guess the UAW has one, because its vice president, Ken Bannon, used some of the same phrases word for word in an interview. Communication by samizdat. Think what Xerox will do in Russia when it gets going. The rate of disciplinary cases was going up. Turnover was up 2.5 times. Absenteeism was alarming on Mondays and Fridays. Hence, the useless advice never to buy a car built on a Monday or a Friday. But your dealer will tell you his cars are built only on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Furthermore, the workers weren't listening to the foremen and the supervisors. And why? For many, the traditional motivations of job security, money rewards, and opportunity for personal advancement
are proving insufficient. Large numbers of those we hire find factory life so distasteful they quit after only brief exposure to it.
The general increase in real wage levels in our economy has afforded more alternatives for satisfying economic needs.
Because they are unfamiliar with the harsh economic facts of earlier years, new workers have little regard for the consequences if they take a day or two off. The traditional work ethic, the concept that hard work is a virtue and a duty, will undergo additional erosion.
General Motors was going to outflank that stuff with the newest, most automated plant.
Machines would take over a lot of the repetitive jobs.
The plant would be in that cornfield in Ohio,
near Youngstown,
away from all those problems of the,
core city. Everything at Lordstown would be made in America, no imported parts, the apogee of American industrialism. The head of Chevrolet buzzed in for a Knute Rockne pep talk. America was going to make the small car, by golly, and that was the end of the elves in the Black Forest and the industrious Yellow Peril in Toyota City, who thought they had been in the small car business. Plane loads of newsmen were flown in. The line is going to do 100 cars an hour, lots of it without any people. Ka-chunk goes the machine that pops the wheel rim into the tire. Piff goes the machine that blows up the tire. So what is all this about trouble in Lordstown? The line is not going at 100 cars an hour, at least not much of the time. And there are all these characters, all good UAW Local 1112. Average age 25. The youngest workforce practically anywhere. Peace medals, bell-bottoms, and hair like Prince Valiant. And the union president is 29 and has a Fu Manchu mustache like the one Joe Namath shaved off. And GM is going up the wall. Where is the productivity? Curtis Cox, the supervisor of standards and methods, is getting apoplectic. I see foreign cars in the parking lot, he says. The owners say they are cheaper. How is this country going to compete? The GM people practically weep when they think about Japan. All those nice, industrious workers, singing the alma mater in the morning. Hail to thee, O Mitsubishi. Whistling on their way to work like the Seven Dwarfs. For God's sake, never a strike, never a crossword. Playing on the company teams, asking the foreman if it's okay to get engaged to this very nice girl as soon as the foreman meets her. So I asked General Motors, quite routinely, if I can go see this apogee of American industrialism. Say, Tuesday, and General Motors says no, never. I admit to being a bit stunned. Do they not fly plane loads of people there all the time? Did they not fly alleged same plane loads at the end of the GM strike, together with appropriate refreshment, to watch the first Vega come off the line, with a handout about how the Vega was going to Mrs. Sadie Apple Pie, library assistant of Huckleberry Finn, Illinois, with a quote already from Mrs. Apple Pie? Oh, I have been waiting so long for my Vega. I can't believe it's finally here. I'm so excited. Did they not?
What do they mean? No? Not that guy?
Who the hell do they think I am, Ralph Nader? I begin thumbing my other notebook that has the number of the payphone in the hallway of Nader's boarding house. And it's off to Lordstown. Because even with plant guards, General Motors is not Russia. And anybody who has graduated from the good old U.S. Army knows how to deal with the lower levels of great bureaucracies. Where are you going with that rake? What rake, sir? That rake. Oh, this rake, the captain? Sir? He said take it over there. What captain? The other captain. What other captain? Beats me, Lieutenant. They just told me take the rake. So we are walking around the plant at Lordstown,
all $250 million of it very visible,
like an iron and steel tropical rainforest, with the electric drills screaming like parakeets,
and the Unimate robot welders bending over the Vegas like big mother birds, and the Prince Valiants of Local 1112,
zanking away with their new expensive electrical equipment.
Vegas grow before your eyes.
Beautiful. I recommend it next time you are taking the Howard Johnson tour across the land of the free. But what are these cars waiting for repair? Marked no high beam signal, dome light inoperative, no brakes. No brakes?
No brakes.
But what is this on the bulletin board? Management has experienced serious losses of production due to poor quality workmanship, deliberate restriction of output, failure or refusal to perform job assignments, and sabotage.
Efforts to discourage such actions through the normal application of corrective discipline have not been successful. Accordingly, any further misconduct of this type will be considered cause for severe disciplinary measures, including dismissal. Corrective discipline? My God, you can get court-martialed in this place? They should have an industrial psychologist read the language on the bulletin board. I can hear the glee club louder. Hail to thee, O fair Toyota. Hi there. Hi. What is that? That's the window trim. Is this a good place to work? Well, it will be as soon as we get it shaped up. Would you buy one of these cars? Sure, if it wasn't so expensive. It's a well-engineered little car. Wouldn't you rather be out on your own, say, a garage? Nah, a garage don't have no benefits. Say, I don't want to bother you. 2 of those Vegas just went by without window trim. Well, they all go by without something. This line is moving too fast. That's productivity, man. Oh, is that what they call it? I can give you a few notes of our brilliantly unscientific survey of Lordstown, but they are just that. Our people would rather have had the time off than the overtime, but their wives worked because they needed the extra income. They would tell their brothers to get a job there, and in fact some of them did. Supervisors bugged everybody. Sabotage? Beer cans welded to the inside of a fender? Well, there might be a few hotheads, but that's silly. Man, the Vega is our bread and butter.